the Imperial Era from scratch. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 201, International Students from Converge. Although this world had become known to the world thanks to Thor, Earthlings now knew that many things existed there that they couldn't understand. But witnessing a portal of light suddenly appear and a figure emerge from it was still deeply impactful. This kind of technology that they couldn't comprehend had a far greater impact on Earth's scientific researchers than on ordinary people. For example, Dr. Zhao, whose emotions had calmed down by now, leaned over to examine the Ancient One curiously. "This is Baron David Glamorgan, from Wintertown. This is the Ancient One, from Converge." As the current commander of the Avengers, Steve was half-owner of Avengers Tower and felt obligated to introduce the guests. "This is Helen Zhao, a very talented scientist." "Hello." Dr. Zhao smiled and nodded at David and the Ancient One. She was also somewhat curious about Wintertown, a city in another world. But at this moment, her attention was completely drawn to the Ancient One. Converge? Is it also in another world? And the term mage, did it mean that the Ancient One was using magic? No, Converge is on Earth. On Earth? Dr. Zhao glanced at Steve. Did this mean magic had always existed on Earth? Converge is located deep in the mountains, unknown to most people. Its mages secretly protect Earth from the evil forces of other dimensions. As Steve introduced Converge to Dr. Zhao, the Ancient One and David discussed another matter. About that winter festival. When are you planning to hold it? After the last harvest in autumn, David had already decided to make Winter Festival a permanent festival in Wintertown. This year's first celebration would celebrate the town's founding, and subsequent ones would celebrate the harvest after a year of hard work. David glanced at the Ancient One, sensing that he had come to him specifically for more than just the Winter Festival. As soon as he looked over, the Ancient One guessed David's thoughts. David wasn't one to hide his inner thoughts. Furthermore, from their previous conversation, the Ancient One knew David didn't like to beat around the bush. Direct communication was the best option. So, the Ancient One stated his plans directly. "I heard from Steve that your territory is already built." "Yes, and there's a dedicated Cathedral of Light to train followers of the light." "Yes." "You want some mages to come to Wintertown to study the light." David reacted quickly, immediately understanding why the Ancient One had contacted him. The Ancient One had told him that she had chosen Steve as the new Sorcerer Supreme to spread the power of the light, a power that offered no additional cost, throughout Converge. However, Steve was studying various mystical knowledge with her, and in his spare time, he had to deal with the Avengers, SHIELD, and Hydra, leaving him with no time or energy to instruct other mages in the light. So, when the Ancient One learned that David's Wintertown had completed construction, had built a Cathedral of Light, and had dedicated priests ready to train followers of the light, he wanted to send a few mages there to study. "So, you want to send some international students to Wintertown?" "That's right, it's a small matter." "No problem at all," David was about to say. Wasn't such a small matter worth making a special trip? But thinking that this was a sign of respect from the Ancient One as the master of Wintertown, he swallowed the words and asked another question instead. "Can I ask which mages you plan to send to Wintertown?" "Maestro Caecilius, Magia Mordo." Seeing David's expression, the Ancient One knew something as well, so he explained, "I don't think they necessarily have to go that way. You're right, in every way, these two were Converge's most outstanding mages. The only ones who could surpass them were the Ancient One, the Sorcerer Supreme, and Steve, who was sure to be the next Sorcerer Supreme. Even the future king, who was destined to be a great king, was no match for these two at this point." At the same time, David wasn't worried about the two causing any trouble in Wintertown. Not only could he expel them back to the Marvel Universe at any moment, but even Converge's spells wouldn't be usable once they reached Wintertown. Marvel Universe magic involves more than just borrowing mana. It's possible to cultivate it yourself, but it's difficult and rare. Specific spells also have their respective owners. Mages are merely users of spells, and to use them, they must pay a price to the actual owner, creator. In Wintertown, far from the Marvel Universe, many spells are simply unusable because they're beyond its service area. As the two men sealed a friendly exchange between Converge and Wintertown with a few words, the party gradually drew to a close. Some people had already left, and gradually, even the people of Wintertown began to leave. Fortunately, while they needed Steve's help on the way here, they could choose to return to Wintertown on their own, eliminating the need for Steve to act as their chauffeur. As the crowd dwindled, only the Avengers and a few people from Wintertown remained. After concluding her business with David, the Ancient One departed. She hadn't met the other Avengers. Only Steve and Tony, alerted by Jarvis, knew of her presence. Meanwhile, Tony was questioning Steve and David about the Ancient One's identity. Kamartaj? The mage, turning to Steve, he asked, "Is that a mentor you mentioned taking you on as a student?" "Yes, wouldn't you consider me? I think I'm quite talented." Steve's eyes lit up at Tony's words. "Are you sure? If you're really interested, I can take you to Kamartaj." While Tony was pleased to hear Steve's enthusiastic help, he felt something was amiss and hesitated. But going to Kamartaj, it seems, would require a rigorous training? "Oh, you know me, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to endure that kind of life." It's not that exaggerated, actually. Seeing Captain America's determination to drag him into a trap, Tony sensed something was amiss and brushed it off with, "I'll think about it." To change the subject, Tony introduced David to the various Avengers. Besides Bruce Banner, the Hulk, whom he'd met before, there were also Hawkeye Clint Barton, Black Widow Natasha Romanoff, and Thor. David also met Sam Wilson, the Falcon, and James Rhodes, the War Machine, who hadn't yet joined the Avengers. Maria Hill, who was supposed to be working for Tony after SHIELD disbanded, wasn't there. The SHIELD director was also absent. David assumed the Cyclops, knowing he was an alien, would come looking for him. "I know what you're thinking. Fury didn't know you were coming today." "I see." Steve, having joined Hydra, held considerable power. If he wanted, he could easily block all of SHIELD's information sources. After the introductions, the party gradually began to disperse. Most of the people from Wintertown had left, leaving David, held back by Steve and Tony. David figured this was just a gathering for the Avengers themselves. It had nothing to do with him. He wasn't even an Avenger. Tony and Steve then said, "If you wish, you'll be accepted into the Avengers now." Feeling like the Avengers had become some strange organization, David could only say goodbye to his fellow Winterstowners one by one, remaining alone to chat with his new friends. As the conversation progressed, he began to be questioned by a group of people. Unlike David, who knew them well, these people were completely unfamiliar with him, and it was their first time meeting someone from another world. There had been 2 elves there earlier, but the crowd was so large, and no one wanted to be rude, so they only exchanged a few polite words with him. There was no need to pretend now, the rest were all family, and from Steve and Tony's attitudes, it was clear that this Baron David, Glamorgan, was also one of them. Since they were still unfamiliar with each other, everyone's questions were relatively superficial, nothing too in-depth. They didn't even ask about David's abilities. Instead, they inquired about Winterstown, deeply curious about David's territory. David took the opportunity to invite everyone, saying he would be hosting a party to celebrate the opening of Winterstown. At this point, David ran out of topics to talk about with these people. As for the hammer-raising event that followed, someone like him, who had just met him, was clearly not suitable to participate. Want to chat for a while? No, it's not like some intelligent robot will suddenly appear and cause trouble. David suddenly remembered something. Without Ultron, what had become of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver? Could these twins, with no ties in this world, possibly dig up Winterfell? Steve didn't know David was thinking about his Hydra generals, but he simply thought that the absence of Ultron was a good thing, as it would prevent many subsequent events from happening. Earth would usher in a period of relative peace, allowing him to focus on dealing with Hydra's problems and preparing for Thanos' arrival. For example, keep this. David glanced at the small box in his hand, giving Steve a puzzled look. What is this? The Mind Stone. Although he knew it was just a piece of stone outside the Marvel Universe, David immediately put it away. It would be nice to use as a decorative ornament or a paperweight, right? Chapter 202 The Threat from Orcs. Taking the souvenir from Captain America Steve, David returned to Wintertown and placed the small box containing the Mind Stone in his desk drawer. Before closing the drawer, David wondered if Steve might drop off the other stones in his possession someday. Should he bring Loki along to see his drawer? Thoughts wandering, David returned to his bedroom and drifted off to sleep. Despite the alcoholic beverages, David hadn't suffered from a hangover or difficulty waking up. He even rose earlier than usual. Standing on the rooftop of Castle Glamorgan, David watched the sun slowly rise over the horizon, bathing the newly built winter town in a vibrant hue. Of course, this was just David's opinion. He often felt a special emotion for the town he had personally built. Up so early today, David was still surveying his own city when he sensed someone approaching from behind and knew who it was. "Are you not used to sleeping?" "No, I'm very comfortable here." "It's actually Sparta that's going to be a struggle." Helen walked over to David's side, standing with him on the edge of the rooftop, looking towards the south of Wintertown, where the buildings were now the most numerous. As the sun gradually rose, Wintertown gradually became bustling with activity, with more and more houses lighting up. Electric lights, running water, and all sorts of electrical appliances. Helen saw many things in Wintertown that she had never even dreamed of, and experienced what true comfort meant. In comparison, her life in Sparta was barely any different from that of a beast. This stark difference made her even more reluctant to leave Wintertown, hoping to live here forever. Becoming David's wife was naturally her biggest goal. Even if that didn't work out, she hoped to stay. She hoped to grow tea in Sparta and bring a group of servants to make Glamorgan Castle bustling, all efforts to achieve her goals. Besides these, when she heard David wanted to expand Wintertown's military, she also wanted to offer some help. Soldiers, yes, Helen explained that Sparta had no shortage of strong, and capable men, making them an excellent source of recruits. "If you need them, I can bring some over." Helen explained that these Spartan soldiers were strong, hardy, and not demanding, unlike David's winter knights, who were expensive. It's certainly an option. David initially considered declining, but then thought, training a secondary legion seemed reasonable. With the growth of Wintertown, the area requiring defense expanded, necessitating a significant increase in manpower. And these Spartans, already soldiers, were easier to train into elite units than civilians. Furthermore, David could sense Helen's ulterior motives. Training a group of soldiers, who were Spartans themselves, would naturally be closer to Helen, the Spartan princess, and would become her biggest supporters within Wintertown. Furthermore, these Spartan soldiers could contribute to Sparta upon their return, passing on what they had learned from Wintertown to the people of Sparta. If some mysterious power could be transmitted back to Sparta, it could make Sparta an even more powerful nation. But these were minor matters, of little consequence to David. "We do need manpower. Since you're so inclined, bring some Spartans," David instructed. Since only a few of the devices Medivh had built to learn the Bronian language were available, Helen could bring them over gradually. Let them learn the Bronian language first, and then bring in new recruits. "I know how," Helen thought for a moment, then asked about the ideal number of men. "Let's start with 100. 100 Spartans would establish the framework of the Spartan Legion. If expansion were needed later, these 100 would form the foundation." Spartan, first phase, the word suddenly popped into David's mind, and he, who had been considering whether to train these Spartans into heavily armored soldiers, suddenly had a distorted vision. From ancient soldiers in heavy infantry armor, he had become airborne troops in mobile battle armor. That sounds quite interesting. 300 Hell paratroopers would then be airdropped directly into the enemy's home base. What a spectacular sight that would be. Having been distracted by Helen's thoughts, David stopped enjoying the breeze on the rooftop and, while chatting, headed to the office to begin his workday. David had anticipated that for the next period, he would wait patiently and be wary of any disturbances from the surrounding villages. However, things don't always unfold as expected. With the arrival of late autumn, David keenly noticed that Wintertown's population had grown much faster, quickly surpassing 1,000. Initially, he thought the surrounding towns had taken action, but after questioning Eva and Weatherby Swan, he learned that something seemed to be amiss at Snowfort. Farmers, soldiers, and artisans from the surrounding villages, who had once belonged to the Iron Tree Fort nobility, had been withdrawn from Snowfort. The remaining ones were free farmers from across the Kingdom of Tiran, effectively abandoned by the villages they had joined. Aside from a few who felt they had snagged a bargain by monopolizing vast tracts of farmland and decided to stay, the remaining free farmers fled to Wintertown. In other words, after painstakingly wasting over 6 months, these farmers finally arrived in Wintertown. However, compared to the farmers who first arrived in Wintertown, these newcomers had nothing and would not receive the same preferential treatment as those who had previously arrived: free housing, adequate food, and ownership of farmland upon clearing it. Those who now arrived in Wintertown needed to borrow money from Wintertown or their lords to ensure they could survive the winter. To earn a living, they had no choice but to work for Wintertown's existing residents. Their arrival also perfectly filled the void left in Wintertown, allowing its shops to resume operations. So, now, Wintertown and Snow are the only ones left in the entire northern plains. RC flew over the entire plains again, assessing the situation in the surrounding villages and towns, and then reported to David. And Frostbite, David was speechless. He'd been so cautious, so prepared, even beginning to mobilize the Spartanite to bolster his forces. But before he could even begin, the surrounding forces were completely destroyed. While some villages still had a few people left, the situation was similar to David's situation defending the pioneer camp alone. It barely qualifies as a village. These guys are even more vulnerable than I expected. Curling his lips, David inquired about the situation at Snowfort. They'd actually pulled all the forces from the northern plains together. Was Snowfort in such dire straits? It's not that Snowfort is in dire straits. Snowfort hasn't been attacked by orcs yet. It wasn't RC who reported this, but Vanessa Van Cleef, who had accompanied RC on the trip, disembarked at Snowfort, and, after carefully gathering information, returned with RC. All the villages east of Snowfort have fallen, including the two closest towns, built to the size of towns. These two towns were built with Orcish concerns in mind, investing significant resources from the outset to create semi-military facilities that served as outposts for Snowfort. However, they were easily overrun and captured by the orcs, prompting Snowfort to realize the orc threat was greater than anticipated, leading to such a drastic response. The forces behind those villages realized that if Snowfort fell, they wouldn't be able to withstand it. For various reasons, they concentrated all their efforts on defending Snowfort first. Vanessa shared all the information she had gathered, including that Snowfort was reinforcing its walls and rushing to produce more weapons. The 1,000 soldiers originally assigned as auxiliary forces had also been armed, and Snowfort had mobilized all its available forces. Are the orcs so formidable? David reflected carefully on his previous encounter with the orcs. It seemed the human soldiers of this world hadn't suffered much in their battles with the orcs, had they? Considering the number of reinforcements Iron Tree Castle had previously sent, Snowfort was still so tense. So, how many orcs were there? This is the image I captured. RC, who looked human, was a Cybertronian after all. Her eyes gleamed, and David and the military personnel in Wintertown all saw the holographic image RC had filmed. There are at least 3,000 orcs. Floyd, looking at the aerial image RC had released and the dense swarm of orcs on the ground, felt his scalp tingle. That's a portion of them. I also saw several smaller orc forces scattered across the plains east of Snowfort. As RC explained, the holographic imagery kept switching. Some of them are heading towards Frostfort. Gareth and Floyd were silent. Krauser frowned at the number, but when they looked at the Lord, they found that Baron Glamorgan remained calm. It seemed that the staggering number of orcs didn't bother him. In reality, David was currently debating whether he should offer some assistance. After all, if Snowfort fell, his own Wintertown would have to face the orcs head-on. If he helped, the main battle would be on someone else's territory, so even if they were beaten to pulp, he wouldn't mind. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 203 Power Armor. He had painstakingly built Wintertown after years of painstaking effort. Everything in Wintertown was now beautiful, and he didn't want orcs to come and wreak havoc. Even if it was just muddying the pristine streets with mud, he couldn't tolerate it. Therefore, it would be best to eliminate this threat before the orcs entered Wintertown's territory. Looking at the image projected by RC, David assessed the situation. He didn't believe these orcs could truly threaten him. He was calculating how much ammunition would be needed. And with Wintertown's current projectile capability, could they be quickly eliminated? After some calculations, he concluded that the most reliable and efficient way to eliminate the orcs was to bring in the Lordaeron artillery regiment. By then, not even 10,000 orcs, or even several times that number, would be unable to set foot on Wintertown's territory. That's ridiculous. I don't think we'll need it. David had always hoped for the steady growth of his power, to be able to resolve the world's troubles with the power at his disposal. He kept requests for support from other worlds as a hidden weapon, never to be deployed until a crisis struck. While this was like nurturing a serialized online novel, it could easily become useless or even die. He remained undeterred. "Is Tony still in town?" David recalled, his thoughts wandering for a moment before he reached a conclusion. Mr. Stark is testing various devices in his experiments. Eva kept tabs on the town, checking in almost daily to see if anyone was there and what they were doing. This ensured she could provide a clear and prompt response whenever David needed to speak to someone. It was no easy task, especially as Wintertown grew and more people arrived. Eva now spent considerable time daily checking everyone's situation. Fortunately, David had appointed Weatherby Swan as administrative officer, taking on much of Eva's responsibilities. "Perfect. I'll go see if his lab can meet my needs." He then issued several orders to the military leaders beside him: increase patrol frequency to ensure no orcs bypass Snowfrest and enter Wintertown's territory. Besides RC's frequent aerial patrols, the Black Hawk helicopters and Harrier fighters couldn't just sit there gathering dust. They needed to take off regularly for reconnaissance missions. But, currently, only Jack Krauser in the Order can safely take off and land a Black Hawk helicopter. Speaking of piloting a plane, Gareth and Floyd were both frustrated. They were overwhelmed by the various instruments and data on the plane. They barely memorized their functions, but they could manage to get the plane off the ground. As for landing, that's why I want you to practice more. Flying a plane is similar to driving a car. It takes practice to truly master it. Although the two knights felt that driving a car on the ground required a different level of skill and mental fortitude than flying a plane, the Lord had already spoken. Could they, as subordinates, continue to make excuses? There was nothing more to say. Flying lessons would definitely be the focus of the 30 soldiers of the Winter Knights training. Floyd felt a sense of relief at this thought. Lord Glamorgan had previously mentioned that approximately 100 additional recruits would be sent to him for training. Furthermore, he had previously mentioned recruiting a number of new recruits from the civilians who had recently arrived in Wintertown. He would be busy training the new recruits, which would allow him to train them to avoid this round of flight training. A delighted Floyd and Gareth, who was constantly mulling over the next arrangements for the pilots, left Castle Glamorgan one after another. Jack Krauser was left behind by David, who took him to Tony Stark's laboratory in Wintertown. While it might be called a laboratory, it actually looked like a luxurious manor. Tony Stark had made it his residence in Wintertown, where he would conduct experiments and research. The manor was located deep in the winter forest north of Wintertown, further north than the waterworks, making it the northernmost building in Wintertown. The advantage of this location is that it's surrounded by dense forest. The towering trees form a natural wall, effectively concealing the manor. Even from the rooftops of Castle Glamorgan, Tony Stark Manor is difficult to see directly. Its remote location, sheltered from ordinary intrusion, perfectly suits Tony's requirements. "Why did you suddenly come to my place? I thought you weren't interested in these things." David had previously invited him to Avengers Tower, but he hadn't accompanied him to tour the lab, instead wandering around with several women. At that moment, Tony Stark suddenly realized he'd been wrong. David wasn't like him, he was a much worse jerk. But joking aside, Tony knew David's sudden visit meant something important, so he inquired about his true purpose. "I need to confirm, can you produce Iron Man armor here now?" "Iron Man armor?" Tony looked at David with suspicion. "You don't want my Iron Man armor technology, do you?" "I do have a similar idea," David, true to his usual style, stated his purpose directly. Tony hadn't expected David to be so direct, not even trying to hide his intentions. This straightforward and frank attitude actually eased his doubts. He also realized that David could transform into a Cybertronian and was a combat machine even more powerful than the Iron Man armor, so it was definitely not David's intention to use his own invention. In other words, David wanted to arm someone with the Iron Man armor? Why did this idea suddenly arise? His clever mind immediately provided him with several answers, and Tony quickly found the correct one. Who is Wintertown going to war with? Is there a force trying to invade Wintertown? Tony had analyzed David's personality and style, and he was certain that David was taking a steady and cautious approach to managing his territory, rather than blindly expanding. Given Wintertown's current population and composition, and David's past behavior, he certainly wasn't planning to initiate a foreign war. Wintertown hadn't yet fully absorbed all the territory it had acquired, so there was no need for further expansion. Even if David wanted to quickly take control of the entire northern plains, he'd need to recruit and train more soldiers. Otherwise, how much territory could the Winter Knights, with only 30 men, capture? The truth was clear: someone was planning an attack on Wintertown, and David wanted to quickly improve his military strength. The simplest and most direct way, of course, was to upgrade his equipment. "Do you want me to call some friends over for help?" "Not yet," David briefly described the orc situation. And Tony finally understood what had happened east of Wintertown. "Although I've known for a while that things weren't peaceful here, I didn't expect to encounter something like this so soon." Tony understood why David had asked you if he could produce Iron Man armor. "So, you want me to help you build a batch of Iron Man armor to arm your 30 knights?" 30 for now, but that'll increase soon. "Besides, I don't need the same Iron Man armor you usually wear." Tony Stark's Iron Man armor is highly technological, integrating a wealth of advanced technology. He usually uses a universal model to cope with a variety of situations. But that's not what David wants. What he wants is simple: a single soldier firepower platform. "Oh, that's a really crude idea," Tony complained at first, then expressed understanding for David's choice. "This kind of power armor you're talking about isn't difficult to make. In fact, even without Tony Stark, David could create something similar if he mobilized all the technologies currently available in Wintertown, including alchemy, crystal power, and spatial storage." However, Tony Stark possessed mature technology and extensive experience in the manufacture and use of Iron Man armor. This meant he had a relatively mature framework, making modifications and additions much simpler and less time-consuming than slowly constructing a new one. "Tell me what you want from this armor," Tony said, leading David to his lab. He activated a holographic workbench, where he prepared to design David's desired power armor. David then noticed Sheldon, Leonard, and the others were also present. Upon seeing David, they came up to greet him and soon realized he was seeking Tony Stark's assistance in crafting power armor for his Winter Knights. "You want to make power armor for them?" "Yes." David noticed Sheldon's voice trembled slightly, a trait he had seen several times, indicating intense excitement. "Oh, damn!" Sheldon turned around and ran to the side, holding his laptop over. After a few quick operations, he turned the monitor to David and said with a smile as if he was going to plot against Batman, "I strongly recommend the Thor's Hammer power armor to you, Lord Baron Glamorgan." David looked at Sheldon, then at Leonard and others who were also full of expectations, then turned to look at Tony. "Can you build this thing, Tony?" Chapter 204: Seeking Help from Wintertown. If it were just a knockoff, it wouldn't be a difficult task. But to fully recreate this Mjolnir-powered armor, while a bit more involved, Tony was confident it was possible. It would just take time. "I can definitely build it, but are you willing to wait while I slowly research the various functions of this armor?" "I'm not interested in waiting." David shook his head and directly stated his requirements: a single soldier-powered armor capable of carrying grenade launchers, heavy machine guns, and other firepower, capable of carrying these weapons and ammunition while ensuring sufficient mobility. Simple and straightforward. Don't we need to consider defense? Defense can be achieved through the armor itself. The armor forged with crystal or powder already has an energy shield. Tony had almost forgotten that Wintertown had such a thing. What about the thrusters? Just make sure they can land smoothly and safely when airborne. That's not a big deal. Tony listened to David's request and understood that this power armor didn't require special combat environments, but was only used for ground combat in this world. It's mainly about power, transmission, shock absorption, and weapon systems. Wintertown had space technology, and David also had Cybertron compression technology. These things would ensure that the weapon system's ammunition supply would not be limited by the armor size. In the end, the only similarity between the final product and the Mjolnir power armor in Sheldon's notebook was its appearance. The rest of the similarities were not significant. How is it? Can it be built? We need to solve a few problems first. Would the weapon system use Cybertron compression technology? Or the space technology provided by Pierre? From the perspective of armor practicality, Cybertron compression technology would be better. But Tony needed some time to fully grasp this unfamiliar technology. Therefore, from an efficiency perspective, directly using the space metal provided by Pierre to create a large capacity magazine and then attaching it as a replacement accessory to existing weapons is a simpler and more convenient option. In that case, let's choose a grenade launcher or a missile launcher. He strapped both launchers to his shoulders, with a missile or grenade feeder mounted on his back. For general firepower, the standard Garen rifle currently in Wintertown is sufficient. Even without using powerful ammunition, this dwarven modified rifle packs a decent punch. As for the lack of firepower, could some soldiers opt for Vulcan cannons? After a moment's deliberation, David was already satisfied with a holographic image before him. This power armor wasn't particularly powerful, but it was enough for 30 winter nights to dominate thousands of orcs. Given that soldiers could use storage tools to carry ammunition, their combat endurance would no longer be limited by ammunition, but by weapon overheating. Furthermore, with the winter knight's increasingly erratic style, there was also the question of what kind of mounts they would use in the future. Let's build one first and see how it works, leave it to me. This job is no problem for me. You should be pushing Pierre. Tony said that as long as Pierre and Will could keep up the production, he could build all 30 sets of Winter Knight's power armor in just one day. After the business was over, David finally had the time to look around Tony's lab. It was still quite messy, just a bunch of experimental equipment, but David had no idea what they were used for. You said that as long as Pierre and Will can supply you with the parts and materials you need, you can produce 30 sets of power armor in a day. David turned to look at Tony. Have you already set up a production line here? Yes, underground, fully automated, of course. Tony looked very proud. He had always believed that his technology was ahead of the rest of Earth. Even now that he knew about technology from other worlds, even aliens, he was confident that he would soon catch up, or even surpass it. Jarvis will be monitoring and in charge. Jarvis? Did you set up an extension here? Yes. After some thought, Tony decided to continue using Jarvis. He had grown accustomed to this old friend. After all, he only needed to carry a device between the two worlds, and the data on both sides would be synchronized without any interruption. At the same time, to ensure that he could exert maximum combat power in Wintertown, Tony had begun considering launching a synchronous satellite there. Listening to Tony's various plans, David could only nod dryly to indicate his understanding. Tony's plan to launch a satellite wasn't surprising to David, it perfectly suited Tony Stark's character. David even felt that if newcomers from an advanced civilization arrived, Tony would instantly upgrade his technology. Considering Wintertown would also benefit greatly from this, David decided to let Tony run wild. Leaving Stark Manor, David returned directly to his hometown, Castle Glamorgan. As his weapons began to upgrade and his army expanded, David began to consider taking advantage of the orcs' attack to seize Frosttown. While he could have seized Frosttown at any time, what then? Frosttown wasn't far away, but it couldn't be integrated with Wintertown anytime soon, forcing him to govern independently. He had limited personnel, and even the resident security officer couldn't be found, so he considered recruiting one from another world. Who would he make mayor of Frosttown after he captured it? Even if he were to govern Frosttown as a border fortress, it would still require a chief officer. Because of this awkward situation, he'd been ignoring Frostbite Town, leaving the forest kid to develop that land for him. He had even closer land he hadn't yet reclaimed. Sean Forrester had no idea his good neighbor was thinking of him. The fourth son of the Forrester family in Iron Tree Keep was deeply troubled by the report before him. Are you sure? Looking at the two soldiers before him, Sean Forrester desperately hoped they would answer, not quite. However, his hope was dashed by the soldier's decisive response. I'm sure, sir. The soldier pounded his chest, as if to assure himself of the truth of his words. At least 500 orcs are advancing towards Frostbite Town. Where are the weapons? Sean Forrester abandoned his last shred of hope and tried to remain calm. He hoped to be an excellent nobleman and a good lord. As the mayor of Frostbite, he absolutely could not show any panic when facing the enemy. Although he had previously lost face against that damned Baron Glamorgan, he would never make a similar mistake again. Moreover, the situation this time was completely different. Although the protective gear on those orcs is simple and even crude, they are indeed wearing armor, and every orc is carrying a weapon. Are they all soldiers? Or are they all ordinary militia? Sean Forrester wanted to confirm how many of these 500 orcs were truly elite. My lord, I think we cannot judge these orcs by our standards, the knight beside him whispered to Sean Forrester, saying that he did not believe these orcs and humans had the same military composition. The knight's warning made Sean Forrester realize his mistake. He immediately thanked the knight beside him. Thank you for the heads up, Pratt. Let's assume the worst-case scenario. These 500 orcs are all elite warriors. With that, the room fell into an eerie silence, everyone frowning. 500 orcs, How could Frostbite Town withstand them? Sir, we should call for reinforcements. Frostbite Town currently had 50 soldiers, all elite warriors from Iron Tree Keep, including 10 cavalrymen from the Iron Tree Knights. But the orcs were too numerous. Furthermore, according to previous intelligence, the orcs' combat effectiveness was no less than that of Iron Tree Keep's elite soldiers. Under these circumstances, Knight Pratt doubted Frostbite Town had the necessary strength to withstand an attack by 500 orcs. Who? Snaufort, Forrest sighed helplessly. The situation in Snaufort isn't much better than ours, sir. We can ask for help from Wintertown. Knight Pratt, as the Forrest family's special guard for Sheen, was of course aware of the previous incident between Frost and Wintertown, and even more so of Sheen Forrest's feelings towards the Baron of Glamorgan. But as a guard, he had to fulfill his duty, to ensure Sheen Forrest's safety at all costs. In this situation, he couldn't think of a safer place than Wintertown. Indeed, Knight Pratt's real desire wasn't to seek help. He hoped Sheen Forrest would flee directly to Wintertown, or perhaps bypass Wintertown's territory to Northfield Outpost, and then return to Iron Tree Keep. Even if he couldn't return to Iron Tree Keep, staying in Wintertown would be safer than defending Frosttown. After all, Wintertown was protected by a terrifying and powerful pink dragon. With that kind of monster, even a larger number of orcs wouldn't be able to easily capture Wintertown, would they? There was only one problem with his suggestion, and that was the biggest one, Sean Forrester's idea. The Forrester family's fourth son's face turned from blue to red, then from red to white. After a long pause, he sighed dejectedly. Has the situation really gotten this bad? No one answered him, but it felt as if everyone had. Chapter 205, Initial Show of Strength. Sean Forrester soon stopped debating whether to seek help from Wintertown. The orcs gave him a clear answer. Seeing the orcs overrun the farmland his town had painstakingly cultivated, and harvesting the potatoes, the most crucial harvest before winter, Sean Forrester knew that even if they could hold on to Frosttown, they would never survive the winter. Unlike other towns, Frosttown was established relatively early and knew the harsh winters of the northern plains. In this situation, not only were their winter food reserves scarce, but even family support was impossible to deliver. Retreat. Knight Pratt looked at Sean Forrester. He was genuinely worried about the Forrester son, and in a fit of rage, he ordered a decisive battle with the orcs. He didn't mind dying in battle, but Sean Forrester absolutely couldn't die here. My lord, retreat towards Wintertown. I will lead the soldiers to buy you time. Sean Forrester sighed painfully, finally uttering the words, retreat. As soon as the order was uttered, Sean Forrester felt a sudden sense of relief. He suddenly realized that, as long as he stopped dwelling on the past, retreat was the right thing to do. The people of Frostbite were highly mobile, or perhaps it could be that since they learned that a large number of orcs were approaching Frostbite, they had been prepared to flee at any moment. As soon as Sean Forrester's official order came down, the residents of Frostbite immediately grabbed their bags and prepared to flee with the mayor. Afterward, everyone could only pray that the orcs would continue harvesting the fields and ignore the fleeing people. Unfortunately, their prayers were in vain. Although the orcs were busy harvesting their crops, they were not about to let the humans go. Just as the residents of Frostbite were moving towards Wintertown, a group of orc soldiers rushed over, howling. Then, as Frostbite watched in despair, they were blasted to pieces by a sudden attack from the air. It's the Wintertown dragon. The residents of Frostbite looked up and immediately saw a pink sliver soaring in the sky. It was the familiar pink dragon, pink monster, from Wintertown. Once, it had been their greatest fear. But today, it was their hope for survival. The pink dragon, emitting a strange roar, circled in the air a few times before dropping several flaming iron rods at another group of approaching orcs. After a deafening explosion, some of the orcs were completely fused into the earth. Frostbite, including Sean Forrester, breathed a sigh of relief. Only then did Sean Forrester have the heart to wonder why the Wintertown pink dragon had saved them. Sir, we are already on Wintertown territory, Pratt, sensing Sean's confusion, whispered a reminder to his mayor. Following Pratt's instructions, Sean Forrester looked to the side and saw they were already standing next to the Welcome to Wintertown sign. According to Wintertown's original statement, the land they were standing on was Wintertown's territory. Even though this territory bordered Frostbite, anyone from Frostbite could be warned or even arrested for urinating on Wintertown territory if they strayed too far. This act, which he had repeatedly denounced as shameless, shameless, now became his lifeline, leaving Sean unsure how to react. Just as he felt both relieved and speechless, a roar different from the pink dragon's roar echoed overhead. Looking up, he saw a giant iron gray bird hovering overhead. That's, how many monsters are there in Wintertown? They had never seen this giant bird before. Sean knew that Wintertown had a black monster besides the pink one, but the one above wasn't black, and its appearance was different from the rumors. Floyd, unaware of Sean Forrester's thoughts below, stood before the open door of the Quinjet, wearing Wintertown's latest power armor. After a moment's hesitation, he finally mustered the courage to jump. Floyd, heavily armored, was falling rapidly, but as he leaped out of the door, the thrusters on his back activated, instantly slowing his descent and allowing him to land firmly on the ground. Even so, Floyd's appearance had a profound impact on the group before him, especially since he wasn't the only one jumping from the air. Two soldiers, also clad in full body armor, followed closely behind. Boom. Boom. The three men landed with a resounding sound. Sean Forrester, standing not far ahead, could even feel the vibrations from the ground. Floyd, clad in his power armor, felt nothing. He felt his footing was steady, and there was no significant recoil. It was completely different from the experience of leaping from a horse in heavy armor. It felt like stepping down a flight of stairs less than a palm's height. This thing is pretty good. Internally praising the power armor, Floyd stepped in front of Sean Forrester and issued a warning to the Frostblight Mayor. You have invaded Winterblight's territory. Please make your intentions known, Mayor Sean Forrester. Sean Forrester felt he was being deliberately provocative. Anyone with eyesight would understand what was going on in his current situation, right? However, he was ultimately a man of rules, understanding that the other party was simply following a formal procedure. He honestly answered the other party's question. Frostbite was attacked by orcs, and I was forced to lead the residents of Frostbite to Winterbite for refuge. Then, as the mayor of Frostbite, Sean Forrester formally requested assistance from Baron David Glamorgan, Lord of Winterbite, hoping that Baron David Glamorgan, guardian of the Great Tiran Kingdom's borders and Lord of Winterbite, would lend a hand to Frostbite. I understand your purpose. I will personally escort you to see the Lord later. Floyd's inquiry was indeed a formal one. After answering Sean Forrester, Floyd immediately ordered the two soldiers behind him to prepare for the attack. After RC had eliminated two groups of orcs in midair, they had not retreated, but instead had intensified their ferocity. They glared fiercely at the two monsters in the air and a large number of humans nearby. They decided to temporarily halt their harvest and eliminate the humans first. A powerful orc roared in a language the humans couldn't understand, and the orcs began to form up. Eventually, over 400 orcs roared and charged towards Floyd and his men. Floyd noticed that some orcs mounted on giant wolves were flanking him and his men. One of the wolf cavalry was clearly moving to cut off their retreat and prevent their escape. Tisk. A while ago, facing this dire situation, Floyd felt that all he could do was fight to the death. Now he didn't think so. Ignore the cavalry. Eliminate these orcs, Floyd commanded the two soldiers beside him. Simultaneously, the Quinjet continued to fly forward, ignoring the orcs' barrage of arrows, spears, and axes. Two more soldiers descended from the rear hatch and were flung straight into the heart of the orc formation. Unlike Floyd's previous situation, these two soldiers in mobile armor were suspended in midair with their back thrusters, sending several iron lumps flying from their shoulders. These lumps scattered among the orcs below, exploding like dazzling fireworks. In the blink of an eye, they cleared a gap and disrupted the orcs' charge. Attack! Floyd waved his hand, and with the two soldiers beside him, rifles raised, they charged towards the orcs. The three of them continuously launched iron lumps from their shoulders, while Floyd's power armor also housed a 6-barreled Vulcan cannon, which hummed and spewed long tongues of flame, instantly mowing down a swarm of orcs. Sean Forrester and Knight Pratt stood nearby, stunned as the Wintertown soldiers battled the orcs. The disparity in numbers was nearly 500 orcs against 5 men. How is this possible? Even if the Wintertown soldiers were incredibly formidable, armed with those bizarre weapons, they couldn't outnumber them, right? However, Pratt's prediction didn't materialize. He keenly noticed that even if the orcs' weapons struck the soldiers, they had no effect. Their armor, aside from emitting a faint glow, was incapable of causing any damage to the Wintertown soldiers. Oh, those cavalrymen. He turned to look at the orc wolf riders, only to find that their limbs had long since been reduced to fragments, scattered on the ground not far away. A pink dragon roared overhead, as if mocking the orcs' stupidity. Meanwhile, the iron-gray monster that had dropped 5 soldiers was now spewing long tongues of flame, slicing the orcs on the ground into tiny pieces. Watching all this, Sean Forrester felt incredibly fortunate. Fortunately, he hadn't been so impulsive as to launch an attack on Wintertown. Even without mentioning the pink flying dragon in the sky, the 50 men under his command were not enough for a soldier from Wintertown to kill. Chapter 206 Tony Talks the Truth. Floyd had no idea what Sean Forrester was thinking of him at that moment. He was enjoying the battle. The Vulcan cannons on his shoulders had been firing continuously for a while, clearing out a large number of orcs and still having ammunition. However, after the close-quarters melee, Floyd and 2 other soldiers unleashed another round of grenades to clear the area, then habitually drew their swords and shields. These weapons were also specialties of Wintertown. Infused with crystal or powder, these swords could easily pierce orc armor and slay them. Unfortunately, they didn't have much opportunity to demonstrate their superb swordsmanship. By the time he drew his sword and shield, there were few orcs left, and the few that remained began to flee in all directions. The Quinjet NRC in the sky pursued only those fleeing towards Wintertown and Winter Forest. Those fleeing in other directions were not targeted. My lord's orders. Don't pursue the fleeing orcs. Just make sure no orcs stray into Wintertown. RC's voice reached Floyd, and he immediately understood. After ensuring there were no more standing orcs, he ordered 4 soldiers to clear the battlefield, ensuring no orcs were still alive. He then headed towards Sean Forrester. David watched the hologram on the table before him, watching the entire first battle between Wintertown and the orcs. Also present were Eva, Laura, Helen, Gareth Stanton, Weatherby Swan, Will Turner, Elias Parker, Leonard, Sheldon, Tony, and a group of others. David maintained constant communication with the front lines. After having Floyd bring Mayor Sean Forrester to meet him in the Quinjet Tony had provided, the one from Avengers 2, he had Tony turn off the hologram. What are everyone's thoughts? After giving the order, David looked around at the crowd. Everyone seemed still immersed in the earlier battle scene. Gareth Stanton, the Royal Guard Knight, was particularly interested in the new power armor. He felt that if all members of the Winter Knights were equipped with this weapon, Wintertown would soon become the sole power on the northern plains. And commanding such a powerful force, wouldn't he be able to advance even further? Earn a knighthood and join the ranks of true nobility? Weatherby Swan marveled at the sheer number of powerful assets Wintertown possessed. If Port Royal had faced an invasion of these tall, powerful orcs, it would have been difficult. Now, he could comfortably remain in the spacious and bright conference room, watching the powerful soldiers, equipped with advanced weaponry, slaughter the powerful orcs at will. He had no need to worry about the orcs turning the tables and threatening the town where they lived. Sir, I don't think we need to worry about these orcs at all, as long as Tony Stark builds more power armor. Even without further improvements and upgrades, Wintertown can wipe out all the orcs on the northern plains with just the current version. I've never worried about these orcs. David's focus wasn't the orcs themselves, but what he could gain from them. Now that the battle between Snowford and a large number of orcs is imminent, Frosttown has given up resistance and asked us for help. So, do you have any suggestions? Everyone looked at each other. Laura and Helen remained silent. They had no say in these matters, they could just watch from the sidelines. Sheldon, Leonard, and the others were quietly discussing the performance of the power armor, seemingly trying to identify any upgrades or optimizations. Tony wasn't interested in getting involved in Wintertown's future development strategy, so he moved over to Leonard and the others and listened to their discussion. The ones who truly cared about these matters were Gareth Stanton, Elias Parker, Weatherby Swan, and Will Turner, all firmly bound to Wintertown. My lord, the orc threat is directed at the entire Kingdom of Tiran. As the guardian of Tiran's borders, it is your duty to take control of the battle when necessary. Elias Parker pondered for a moment before offering his opinion, especially when only Wintertown's forces remain on the northern plains. Everyone turned to look at the usually quiet and largely invisible ceremonial officer. Even Leonard and Sheldon stopped discussing how to optimize and upgrade their mobile armor. After glancing at Elias, their gazes collectively turned to David. David understood Elias's point. Once Snowforest Castle fell and the last remaining Iron Tree Castle troops were eliminated, Wintertown would become the last remaining Tiran force on the northern plains. If David led his troops to eliminate the invading orcs, the entire northern plains would be ruled by Baron Glamorgan, both de facto and legally. Iron Tree Keep would no longer have any standing or authority to extend its influence into the northern plains, remaining confined to its original territory, with no possibility of further expansion. However, this plan would be tantamount to treating Snauford as a pawn, a mere sacrifice in a struggle for personal gain. The people of Snauford are innocent, David said without further hesitation. He wasn't putting on a show for the people around him. If the soldiers of Iron Tree Keep were to fight the orcs to the death, he wouldn't see anything wrong with their sacrifice. Fighting and sacrificing were their duty. But Snauford didn't just have soldiers, it also had many ordinary people. Was he going to let them die with him? David didn't think he was that cold-blooded. In his past life, or in this, he wasn't a good, or even competent, politician. He couldn't treat people as anything less than human. Even if he never considered himself a good person, he didn't intend to be a villain who treated human life as worthless. Just like just now, he could have easily watched the orcs slaughter every last one of Frostbite Town, then let RC and Floyd take over. But he had RC open fire, saving everyone in Frostbite Town, even though Sean Forrester, his nemesis, was among them. As David spoke those words, the atmosphere in the conference room seemed to shift subtly. David could sense that several people secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Realizing he had successfully survived a test, David knew that if he had accepted Elias Parker's advice, he might never see several people in the room again. Now, David could sense that several people were looking at him with a warmer warmth. It wasn't just Laura and Tony, but even Weatherby Swan and Will looked as if they hadn't made the mistake. It wasn't surprising, after all, no one wanted a cold-blooded friend or leader. Some things, even if they were intellectually right, could still be emotionally uncomfortable. Elias wasn't upset that his suggestion was rejected. He was merely making a suggestion. The real decision rested with Lord Glamorgan, a fact he understood clearly. Then, Lord spread the news that Wintertown, after receiving Frostbite's request for help, dispatched troops to repel the orcs. Keep a close eye on Snauford and intervene when necessary. Spreading the news first was to let the people of Snauford know that Wintertown had the power to defeat the orcs. Whether they believed it or not, when Snauford was in danger, it would be their last hope. Whenever there was hope, those in despair would seize it. Once the people of Snauford could no longer resist, they would undoubtedly seek help from Wintertown. Then, David could march with Wintertown's troops and take over Snauford directly and legally. Once the orcs are repelled, Your Excellency can report directly to His Majesty the King on what has happened in the northern plains and apply to upgrade Wintertown to Wintercity. If occupying Frosttown and Snowburg meant only 2 more outposts for David, then upgrading Wintertown to Wintercity would be far more tempting. Leaving aside the advancement of his title and the expansion of his territory, once he acquired the administrative structure of Wintercity, would his cheat codes be upgraded again? He didn't know what changes would be achieved by another upgrade, but why not upgrade when he had a chance? This wasn't some crappy software from his past life that got worse with each upgrade. Let's do it. The impromptu meeting ended, and everyone dispersed to return to their own affairs. Before leaving, Tony paused before David and jokingly said, "Looks like I'll soon have to address you as Earl, or even Marcus. Good luck. By the way, when you mentioned Wintertown continuing to grow and develop, only then would I be able to travel freely? Were you referring to the territory's status being upgraded?" Tony's reaction was quick, and having noticed the change in David's expression when he heard the word Wintertown, he immediately realized this. Right, after receiving a positive response, Tony glanced around, confirming they were all one of us before whispering, "When are you planning to establish the Kingdom of Winter?" David stared at Tony speechlessly. What kind of truth was he talking about? How could he say that now? Even if he truly had such a plan, he had to wait until all the resources, especially the population, were nearly accumulated. Ahem, don't talk nonsense. I've never thought of that. Chapter 207, Taking Frosttown. David had certainly considered the Kingdom of Winter. He wasn't even satisfied with just establishing a kingdom, he desired to build a vast empire. Then, he would be the Emperor of Brunia. That sounds ominous. Back in his office, David quietly awaited Sean Forrester's arrival. He had just communicated via comms, instructing Floyd to bring Sean Forrester to Wintertown. He knew he must be arriving soon. Sean Forrester followed Floyd aboard the Quinjet, accompanied only by his knight Pratt. Curiously, the two surveyed the interior of the Quinjet. They realized then that this strange bird wasn't some monster, but rather some alchemical creation, controlled by a human. The Quinjet's cabin was largely unobstructed, and upon entering, they could see Sharon Rogers in the front seat. Although it was their first time seeing such a thing, they quickly understood what was going on. Seeing this, Sean Forrest pondered further questions. Where did Wintertown get these powerful alchemical products? His Majesty's support for Wintertown had reached such a level? Did this mean that His Majesty was deeply dissatisfied with Irontree Keep? Was Wintertown actually sent by His Majesty specifically to suppress the nobles of Irontree Keep? How many powerful weapons and equipment were there in Wintertown? How much more powerful equipment did His Majesty possess? He turned to look at Floyd, the personal guard of Baron Glamorgan, Lord of Wintertown, who removed his helmet, revealing his true appearance and introducing himself. Sean Forrest looked at Floyd, then at the other two soldiers. These two were the so-called Winter Knights. With ordinary soldiers wielding such powerful equipment, Sean Forrest naturally stopped dismissing the Winter Knights as a joke concocted by ignorant country nobles. Instead, he seriously wondered how long Irontree Keep could hold out against this onslaught. He had witnessed the Winter Knights' combat prowess firsthand. To say they could defeat 100 alone was an understatement. Sean Forrester even suspected that the 5 men he had met today, combined with the 2 enormous metal birds, could completely annihilate the entire military force of Irontree Keep. Just as Sean and Pratt were about to take a closer look at the men's equipment and the miraculous giant bird, they felt a slight tremor around them before stabilizing. "We're here." Sean Forrester's surprise wasn't fake. He looked at Floyd, his expression clearly asking, "Are we here already?" Floyd nodded at Sean Forrester and gestured toward the open cabin door. "Mayor Sean Forrester, please." Sean stepped out of the Quinjet and immediately took in his surroundings. He came into view of a vast square. The first thing Sean Forrester noticed was the ground beneath his feet, solid, smooth, and clean. He had never seen such ground before in Irontree Keep. "Is this Wintertown?" This is the Wintertown military camp, located in the Winter Forest north of Wintertown. According to David's original plan, this was a place for the Wintertown army to rest and train new recruits. So, when Sean and Pratt disembarked from the Quinjet, they quickly noticed the Spartan 1S undergoing training not far away. These young soldiers, brought from Sparta by Helen, were undergoing basic physical training, currently led by the instructor, Renaud Magraine. Besides these Spartans undergoing basic training, there were also members of the Winter Knights familiarizing themselves with the operation of their power armor. Sean saw several men in power armor constantly running, stopping suddenly, and using their thrusters to perform long-distance leaps. Sean glanced behind him and saw that, in addition to the giant bird he had just disembarked from, there were several other giant birds parked nearby, including the black monster he had heard so much about, the Black Hawk helicopter. Just as he was about to ask, "How do we get to Lord Glamorgan?" a square metal carriage pulled up in front of him. Sean swallowed his question. He recognized the car, of course, though he couldn't understand how it could operate without the need for horses or other animals. Climbing into the back seat of the Humvee, Sean noticed Floyd sitting in the front seat and saying to the person beside him, "To Castle Glamorgan." Sean immediately understood that Castle Glamorgan was Lord Glamorgan's residence in the heart of Wintertown. The car started, speeding along the smooth road. Through the window, Sean scanned the surroundings. The car quickly pulled out of the military camp and onto a road lined with tall trees. Soon, the trees disappeared, and the car left the Winter Forest and entered Wintertown. The road widened, and beautiful buildings began to appear on both sides. Sean looked at the beautiful buildings, the clean streets, even the paths between the buildings were smooth, clean cobblestones. Comparing them to his own frostbite, he found comparing them an insult. He felt that even the inner city of Irontree Keep couldn't compare to Wintertown. Just like when he'd arrived in Wintertown on the giant bird, the car moved at a brisk pace. Before Sean felt he'd seen enough, he'd already seen that magnificent building. Although entering Wintertown from the north, the Humvee didn't enter Glamorgan Castle through the north gate. The north gate led to David's private gardens, which were only for friends. Anyone coming for official business had to enter through the main gate, the south gate. The car drove along the high walls of Winter Fortress all the way to the south gate, allowing Sean Forrester to take in the vast square in front of it and the now iconic Cathedral of Light. Finally, they entered Winter Fortress and stopped in front of Glamorgan Castle. Getting out of the car, Sean looked up at the palace and glanced to both sides. To the left stood another towering building. He had no idea what it was used for, but the military barracks on the other side were immediately apparent. Following Floyd into Glamorgan Castle, Sean was once again impressed by its cleanliness and brightness. He had never before remembered a palace so bright and luminous. Arriving on the second floor, in David's office, Sean Forrester finally met Baron David Glamorgan again. He had once looked down on him, but now he felt he couldn't look him in the eye. "It's a great honor to meet you again, Baron Glamorgan. I must offer my sincerest gratitude for your assistance." His childhood courtesy enabled Sean Forrester to respond promptly and correctly. He expressed his greetings and thanked the man for his assistance. "Mayor Forrester, there's no need to be so polite. It's my duty to protect our territory and eliminate any enemies who dare to offend the Kingdom of Tiran." After a brief greeting, David gestured for Sean Forrester to sit down and speak. Seeing that the other party didn't give him too much trouble, Sean Forrester breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed he wouldn't face any more trouble. The conversation with Sean Forrester wasn't long, and David didn't need Sean Forrester to explain the orcs. He had invited him to sit down and have a face-to-face conversation for a single purpose: the ownership of Frostbite. Sean Forrester, after all, had received an elite education. As long as he kept his mind clear and remained calm, he knew what he should do at this moment. A formal request for help, a request for David Glamorgan, Lord of Winterbite, to help him resist the orc attacks, and a request for Frostbite to be placed under the rule of Baron Glamorgan. Sean Forrester agreed to all of these, affixing his seal on the spot. From then on, Frostbite officially became David's domain, and Sean Forrester even transferred the current residents of Frostbite, excluding the soldiers, to David. Including those indentured farmers who originally belonged to the Forrester family, corresponding contracts would be delivered to David in the future. Honestly, David hadn't expected Sean Forrester to agree so readily. In his cheerful mood, he barely even bothered to mention the past annoyances. "I'd like to write a letter and have my guard Pratt deliver it to the family." Sean Forrester hoped Wintertown could use that strange giant bird to quickly transport Pratt back to Iron Tree Keep. Having personally experienced its speed, he knew just how fast it could fly. "No problem, thank you very much for your generous assistance, Lord Glamorgan." Sean Forrester thanked David again and left his office. Floyd took the two of them directly to the nearby Winter Hotel and arranged accommodations for Sean Forrester. Writing paper, pen, and envelopes were soon delivered to Sean, and upon receiving them, Sean Forrester immediately began writing home. As a night guard, Pratt wasn't supposed to be sneaking at the letter, but Sean Forrester kept reminding him of things, so even without a peek, he knew what Sean had written. Surprisingly, Sean, who had previously held Baron David Glamorgan in high regard, reassured his family that he was safe and repeatedly emphasized that Baron Glamorgan must not be offended, urging his family to establish a friendly relationship with him. After witnessing Wintertown's true power, Sean Forrester's view of Baron Glamorgan was no longer the same. In his eyes, Baron Glamorgan was now more powerful than any other noble in Iron Tree Keep. Chapter 208 Frost Century. With Frostbite now his territory, David's next concern was how to manage this new territory. Move the population inland. Instead of heading to the meeting room, David had Heva summon Weatherby Swan and Gareth Stanton to his office. He would primarily discuss this matter with Administrative Officer Weatherby Swan. Gareth was also summoned, as David planned to transform Frostbite into Frostpost, serving as Wintertown's outermost defensive outpost or fortress. Relocate the farmers from Frostbite to Wintertown, and transform Frostbite into Frostpost to facilitate the stationing of our soldiers. Wouldn't that waste the farmland Frostbite reclaimed? Frostbite had, after all, cultivated some farmland northeast of Wintertown for over a year. While the crop yields couldn't compare to Wintertown's, it was still better than leaving it abandoned, right? It's a shame, but for now, it's just going to lie waste. Rather than wasting manpower cultivating those barren lands, it would be better to use them on the more fertile lands surrounding Wintertown. The crops produced by the two plots of land wouldn't even be on the same scale. Unless David had an idea, though he wasn't sure if it was feasible: get some farm machinery and transform it into transformers. Stationing these agricultural transformers at Frostwatch would not only increase the outpost's combat power, but also ensure the farmland wouldn't be left uncultivated. However, his previous revival of the diggers relied on the fact that they were already transformers. Even if they were mass-produced, they were still Cybertronians at heart. He had merely rekindled and strengthened their spark with holy light, which was completely different from creating something from scratch. Perhaps we could find some mass-produced Decepticons. David shifted his focus. He didn't necessarily need farm machinery. Perhaps he could modify the templates of these mass-produced Decepticons and turn them into farm machinery. Besides the Decepticons, perhaps he could look to the Autobots? Do the Autobots have any farm equipment? Setting that thought aside for now, David continued discussing the relocation with Weatherby, while also asking Gareth how he planned to arrange the rotation at Frostwatch. At this point, a squad at Frostwatch is sufficient to ensure its safety. After witnessing the power of the power armor firsthand, Gareth Stanton had a clear understanding of his own team's combat capabilities. He felt 5 men would be sufficient, but too few would make it difficult to deploy them in certain situations, so he decided to stick with a squad. If all goes well, we can assign some new recruits to be stationed there later. In addition to the 100 new recruits from the first Spartan class, Wintertown had also recruited 50 new recruits from the newly relocated population. Gareth Stanton wasn't sure how many of these 150 would ultimately remain, but some would eventually become recruits for the Winter Order. He didn't expect these recruits to contribute immediately. Sent to outposts was primarily to allow these new recruits to experience combat and understand their responsibilities, perhaps accelerating their development. David had no objection to Gareth's arrangement, his only request being that they not relax requirements in order to increase their numbers. He wanted elite troops. A smaller number was acceptable. But weaklings were unworthy of joining the Winter Knights. Don't worry, sir. Floyd and I guarantee that every soldier in the Winter Knights will be the elite of the elite. When he first arrived in Wintertown, he doubted that such a remote territory on the border of the kingdom could possibly train an elite knightly order. But after living in Wintertown for a while and witnessing all sorts of miraculous things, items, and powers, he had long since changed his mind. Especially with the blessing of the Holy Light, the Winter Knights soldiers' quality continued to improve, and the Lord's continuous supply of powerful weaponry and equipment. Gareth Stanton felt that the Winter Knights would undoubtedly become the most powerful knightly order on the continent of Brunia, their strength astounding to all who witnessed it. He believed it with absolute conviction, and was willing to sacrifice everything for it. After the discussion, the 2 men went off to their respective tasks. Gareth would return to begin arranging the stationing of Frostwatch, Floyd would continue training, and Weatherby Swan would prepare to receive the people of Frosttown. The residents of Frosttown had not returned to their original settlements just because the orcs had been repelled. They were now heading towards Wintertown, led by 2 other Wintertown soldiers. RC was circling overhead, making sure there were no orcs pursuing them and ensuring their safety. After finishing his work, David stood up and paced back and forth in his office before leaving to find the ambulance. Since there was nothing urgent to tend to, he could ask the ambulance if any of the Autobots could transform into farm machinery. When the ambulance was not busy, it would constantly travel back and forth between the 2 worlds, ensuring David and Optimus Prime could always communicate. When he was in Wintertown, he was either studying the light with Lyodrin and Sally Whitemane, or spending time in the garage at Castle Glamorgan studying and understanding it. He'd recently experienced something, and was close to mastering it. Entering the garage, there was no other car besides the ambulance. David's Mustang was usually stored in his Cybertron body, allowing him to use and transform whenever he wanted. Seeing only the ambulance in the empty garage, David thought he should get a few more, at least for visual appeal. Ambulance, how's your light study going? I feel like I've grasped the key. With just a little more effort, I can master this amazing power. Upon seeing David arrive, the ambulance instantly transformed into humanoid form. The high enough clearance allowed him to move freely after transforming, and in fact, even if he casually wandered around Wintertown in human form, the people there wouldn't react in any way. The presence of the Diggers has helped the people of Wintertown become accustomed to the presence of Cybertronians. Given that almost everyone's home was built with Diggers' help, the people of Wintertown are far more welcoming to Cybertronians than to Earthlings from the Transformers universe. This development was naturally reported to Optimus Prime by Ratchet. While delighted, Optimus also realized what David had said: Earthlings will only truly accept and welcome Cybertronians if they can truly have a positive impact on Earthling life. Wintertown is a prime example. So, Optimus Prime has indeed begun to contribute to Earthlings. But his proposal for Earthlings to unite is not so easy to achieve. In Optimus Prime's opinion, there will be no progress unless Earthlings fight for years. David, on the other hand, feels that Optimus Prime has grossly overestimated Earthlings' efficiency. With Earth making little progress and the Decepticons remaining inexorably extinguished, more and more Autobots are eager to settle in Wintertown. Ratchet mentioned this to David. Optimus Prime was taking inventory recently, and perhaps soon David wouldn't have to buy anything himself, so his garage would be overflowing with new cars. At this point, David asked, "Are there any Autobots that can transform into farm machinery, the kind used for plowing and harvesting on Earth?" "Yes." "Well," Ratchet shook his head helplessly. "You know, we Cybertronians are built completely differently from Earthlings, so we don't have any need for crops, and that's why no Transformers have ever been created for that purpose." David nodded helplessly. He hadn't expected that. In any version of the animation or the movies, there hadn't been any Transformers that transformed into farm machinery. Was that simply because Cybertronians didn't have that need? He just didn't know if he could just roll out a new template. David also asked if the Autobots had eliminated any mass-produced Decepticons recently. He asked if he could bring a Decepticon corpse. "Okay, I'll talk to Optimus Prime about this, then I won't disturb you from continuing your light awakening." "Good luck." David left his garage, watching the ambulance transform back into a Hummer search and recovery vehicle. Looking at his expansive garden, David suddenly remembered something else, the wheat golems of Azeroth. But searching his memory carefully, he realized that the wheat golems were strictly speaking robotic sentinels guarding farmland, not machines for tilling the land. Tisk. I thought I'd come up with a substitute. At the same time, David did recall another type of robot actually used for tilling the land, the various agricultural robots in the RoboCop. However, these were human-controlled and their efficiency was not much different from that of ordinary agricultural machinery. How about having Tony build a batch of robot soldiers, farming in their spare time, serving as soldiers in wartime? That seems possible. David immediately prepared to find Tony, transforming into a Tomcat and flying over. However, just as he transformed into Cybertron, before he could release the compressed Tomcat within his body, he saw Laura emerge from Castle Glamorgan and wave. Pausing his transformation, David approached Laura. "What's up? Someone new is here, huh? I just went to Penny Doodles with Sylvanus and Lyandrin, and on my way back, I happened to see someone new arriving in Wintertown." Laura briefly explained the situation, even giving the newcomer a general overview. She was bringing him to meet David, the master of Wintertown. As Laura introduced him, a middle-aged man in a police uniform and a round hat, his face surveying the surroundings with curiosity, appeared in David's sight. Chapter 209, Survivors of the Doomsday World. "Hello, I'm David, Lord of Wintertown." "Hello, I'm Rick Grimes." The man in police uniform introduced himself to David, gazing at him with a look of wonder. "Should I call you Baron? Or Mr. Mayor?" David smiled and told Rick to choose whichever he felt comfortable with. After shaking Rick's hand, he carefully channeled the holy light to examine himself. He quickly concluded that he wasn't infected with any strange virus. Indeed, David recognized this Rick Grimes, the protagonist of The Walking Dead, hailed from the post-apocalyptic world ravaged by a zombie virus. He remembered that all humans in that world were infected, so even those who died of natural causes were transformed into zombies. This meant that Rick must have the virus as well. This was why David hadn't reacted when he saw Leon, but instead carefully examined himself. After a brief conversation, David steered the conversation towards Rick's world. Shortly after Rick woke up in the hospital and learned that the world seemed to be in chaos, overrun by zombies, David suggested running some tests on Rick. Tests? Yes, to make sure you're carrying the virus, isn't it? Otherwise, you'd have turned into a zombie long ago. Carrying the virus doesn't guarantee you're infected, and there can be an incubation period. Don't you want to know for sure? David easily convinced Rick, as Rick also wanted to know for sure if he had the horrific virus. "What do I need to do?" "Don't worry, it's easy." For Wintertown, determining Rick's condition was easy. An ambulance was parked in a nearby garage. A scan would reveal Rick's condition clearly to everyone. When Rick saw the ambulance, the legendary Transformer, he was stunned, completely forgetting Laura's earlier words to him. This place has many people from other worlds. Although he had accepted this incredible fact, he hadn't imagined that these people from other worlds would include Cybertronians. Even with two legendary elves beside him, he didn't think anything of the Transformers. He now realized that this place called Wintertown was even more magical and bizarre than he'd imagined. Only then did Rick regain his composure and focus on his own condition. "How is it? Am I infected with that horrible virus?" "No trace of any unknown virus was found in you, Ratchet compared Rick's information with its database of Earth's human and virus data and found no trace of any unknown virus. "It's confirmed you're clean," Rick breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't want to become one of those undead-like monsters that attack others. Meanwhile, David was secretly wondering, Rick's lack of virus meant he wasn't infected in the original storyline? Or had some mysterious force cleared him of the virus upon his arrival in Wintertown? Whatever the possibility, David no longer had to worry about a sudden zombie outbreak in Wintertown. "I'm sorry to have to welcome you in such a strange way. No, actually, I really appreciate you helping me with the checkup," Rick sincerely thanked David and the ambulance, though his eyes still held a hint of wonder as he looked at the ambulance. "Anyway, welcome to Wintertown." David had originally wanted to ask Tony about the farm robots, but Rick's arrival forced him to put that off. Rick's presence reminded David of something else. He was in need of a sheriff, and Rick was the town's deputy. He had considerable experience in law enforcement. Of course, Rick might not be willing to stay in Wintertown permanently, as he had things he couldn't let go of in his own world. But that didn't mean Rick couldn't help David, because Rick's world was apocalyptic. Although that world was overrun by zombies, many survivors were still struggling to survive. These people were perfect targets for David's Wintertown. Living in harsh conditions, with no future in their own world, they were driven to survive. At the same time, having experienced the apocalypse and the hardships they faced, these people were easier to manage than those in the ordinary world. As for those who refused to be managed, they could simply be expelled. While Rick was roaming around that world, he could help David recruit those ordinary people in distress. Rick had encountered many survivors throughout the storyline, and these were all potential targets. With this in mind, David decided to personally take Rick around Wintertown and discuss his future. Passing through Castle Glamorgan and exiting the Winterhold's main gate, Rick couldn't help but glance back at the familiar building. David understood his reaction and casually explained, "This house was built not long ago, and the person who came up with the design is a physicist living in Los Angeles." Oh, Rick immediately understood why the Lord's residence looked exactly like the house he remembered. It turned out that someone from the same country as him had provided the model. "This is a really nice design, I know what you're thinking. I've been to that country." Ha ha ha, Rick laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Fortunately, David didn't continue the conversation, but moved on to the next topic, introducing Rick to Wintertown and asking Rick what his plans were. Rick looked at the clean, tidy streets, the beautiful houses around him, and the fresh air, all of which made him feel comfortable. If possible, he would very much like to live in this place called Wintertown, but there were some things he had to confirm first. "I want to find my wife and children." Whether his wife was alive or dead, he wanted a definitive answer. If his wife and child were still alive, he would certainly do everything in his power to reunite with them. He could then bring them to Wintertown, away from the world destroyed by the zombies. If they had tragically perished, he didn't know if he could start a new life. He didn't even dare to think about that possibility. He hoped his wife and child had escaped safely when the crisis struck and were now living somewhere safe. "I hope you can be reunited with your family soon." David wished Rick well, explaining the enormous advantages Rick would have if he could travel freely to and from Wintertown. He could flee to Wintertown for refuge in times of crisis, he could obtain weapons and supplies there, and even if injured, he could immediately seek healing from the priests in the Cathedral of Light. Priest? Healing? Rick was already excited at the first few words. He clearly understood how much the ability to return to Wintertown at any time would mean to him. Furthermore, the mayor had explicitly stated that he could restock his weapons, ammunition, food, and water there. He could also come to Wintertown to rest when he felt tired. What does it mean that only this priest is responsible for healing? Are Wintertown's priests also part-time doctors? The priests of the Cathedral of Light believe in the holy light and can use this magical power to heal injuries and illnesses. David raised his hand and gave Rick a simple demonstration. That's the power. Rick felt his body become much healthier, and only then did he realize that this world contains such a mysterious force as magic. Liadrin, one of the elves you met earlier, is the current bishop of the Cathedral of Light. Liadrin had not originally wanted to be bishop, but after the Cathedral of Light was built, she and Sally Whitemane were the only two priests in Wintertown, so she reluctantly took on the position. As Rick listened to David's explanation and looked at the houses along the wide road, a question gradually arose in his heart. I can get so many benefits, so what do I have to give in return? Help me recruit residents. David liked people with clear minds like this. They were much more pleasing than those who only cared about taking without thinking about giving back. He told Rick his plan, and Rick didn't resist David's request. After walking along the road for a while, he noticed that Wintertown was indeed quite sparsely populated. He also didn't think it was a bad idea to bring his own survivors from a world plagued by zombies. Besides, Mayor David had made it clear to him, he wanted civilians, not slaves. The people Rick brought would become official residents of Wintertown, earning wages through work, buying their own homes, and so on, just as they had done before. This was a win-win for both Wintertown and the survivors of the apocalypse. Rick, of course, wouldn't refuse and readily accepted the assignment. Welcome to Wintertown. When Rick agreed to help David recruit residents, he became a member of Wintertown. David said Rick could choose from existing houses or find a vacant lot of his choice and build a completely custom home. In addition, Rick could receive weapons as needed and learn all the knowledge Wintertown had to offer, including holy light, arcane, shamans and so on. Listening to the words David said, Rick seriously doubted that he was not cut out for it, but there was no harm in trying. What if he could learn it? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 210 Winter Festival is coming. He took Rick on a tour to familiarize him with Wintertown. He also introduced him to Jonah, whom he could call upon for food and water whenever needed. He then introduced Rick to Eva and Weatherby Swan. In the future, Rick could call upon Eva when he needed weapons and ammunition. When he brought back survivors from the apocalyptic world, he would contact Weatherby Swan, the administrative officer, who would be responsible for arranging the new residence. Finally, Rick chose a modest two-story house as his new home, where he could rest before returning to his own world to find his wife and children and officially begin recruiting survivors for Wintertown. Rick knew he was officially working for Baron David Glamorgan, and the better his work, the better his future in Wintertown would be. Even before he found his wife and children, he had already found a future to look forward to. This filled him with hope. After a brief rest, he packed up his supplies and set out on his quest to find his wife and children. You want to use Rick to significantly increase Wintertown's population. Laura saw David's concern for Rick clearly and immediately guessed David's intention. Yes, survivors of a post-apocalyptic world like this are the easiest to attract to Wintertown, and, relatively speaking, they're also easy to please. As long as Wintertown can provide a safe and stable living environment, they're happy to live here long-term. Furthermore, most of these post-apocalyptic survivors come from modern society. Their mindset differs somewhat from that of most ordinary people in this world. They don't dwell too much on farming and are more willing to accept jobs like waiters and laborers. I suddenly hope there will be more people from post-apocalyptic worlds in the future. People from movie versions of Resident Evil or The Last of Us are worth looking forward to. And then there's the worlds like Interstellar, where Earth's environment has been drastically altered, forcing humanity to find a new home. Just as David was pondering which other worlds might fit his requirements, Steve arrived in Wintertown with two wizards. David realized that today was a perfect day for welcoming newcomers, so his original plans had to be postponed. Fortunately, Caecilius and Mordo, who Steve had brought with him, didn't require much of his time. A quick reading and getting to know each other would be enough. Steve would handle the introduction of Wintertown. After introducing Liandrin to the two mages from Camartage, the two mages could then accompany her on a tour of Wintertown. After sending the two mages away, Floyd arrived again. What's going on? Sean Forrest has written a letter, hoping we can use the Quinjet to transport Knight Pratt to Iron Tree Keep. Oh, that. David gestured for Floyd to take Knight Pratt directly to Peggy, who should have plenty of free time to do it. There was no particular reason for choosing Peggy over Sharon. Sharon had previously flown the Quinjet, so it was a matter of swapping shifts. Of course, this wasn't necessary. If Peggy needed help and Sharon didn't mind, Sharon could continue to fly. As for what reaction would a Quinjet flying directly to Iron Tree Castle cause? The Quinjet possesses physical stealth, so there's no need to worry about being seen. As for magical detection, the plane won't land inside Iron Tree Castle, it will simply find a suitable location outside to drop Knight Pratt. This is done to avoid exposure. In reality, With rumors of Wintertown possessing dragons spreading throughout the northern plains, even if someone from Iron Tree Castle saw the Quinjet, it wouldn't matter. Watching Floyd leave, David sat at his desk and waited quietly for a moment. Isn't there anything else going on? After ensuring no one was suddenly approaching, he stood up and left Glamorgan Castle, transforming into a Cybertronian form and releasing his tomcat. As the tomcat ejected from his body and grew in size, David leaped up and landed accurately in the cockpit, then soared into the sky. The entire process took the blink of an eye. The black tomcat was already hovering above Glamorgan Castle, circling briefly before heading north. While Wintertown is now many times larger than it was when it had only one street, the distance from Fort Glamorgan to Stark Manor isn't so far that it would take half a day to fly. He only added a slight boost of speed, and in the next second, he was diving toward the ground. He opened the cockpit, jumped out of the plane, and landed safely on the ground. The tomcat then gradually shrank and slipped into the hatch opened at David's shoulder. Finally, he transformed back into human form and raised his hand to greet Tony. "I'm so glad you weren't in the lab today." Tony watched the entire thing unfold as an F-14 Tomcat flew straight toward him. A robot leaped out of the cockpit and landed in front of him. The Tomcat shrank, burrowed into the robot, and the robot took on the form of David. Although he had known about this before, this was the first time Tony had seen David in his Cybertronian form. "I suddenly feel that the manor lacks the necessary defenses, considering that you have important laboratories, weapons equipment, and ammunition production facilities here. I also feel that your defenses are too weak." Stark Manor is located at the northernmost part of Wintertown. Logically, Wintertown's potential enemies should come from the southeast, but he couldn't guarantee absolute safety from the north. Who knows if someone might deliberately circle around and attack from behind. And the possibility of dangerous monsters or races lurking in the north cannot be ruled out. Once we have sufficient manpower, that so-called northern outpost must be regularized. He suddenly felt that the current 150 recruits were a bit too few. Perhaps he could start considering Spartanize. "Right now, I may have to rely more on your iron soldiers. Considering your situation here, my iron soldiers will probably need to be equipped with sufficient weapons." Tony was suddenly speechless at this point. His Stark Industries had already decided to move away from focusing solely on the weapons market and transform into a high-tech conglomerate. But who could have imagined that, just because he developed an interest in the alien city of Wintertown and specifically built a reactor and laboratory there, he'd actually returned to his roots in weapons development and manufacturing. "No conflict," David explained. "The weapons development and manufacturing in Wintertown, along with clean energy, sewage, and garbage disposal on Earth, were all meant to make the world a better place." "You mean, you can make the world a better place? Do you think the world is better the way it is now?" "Well, you have a point. The Kingdom of Winter under your rule would surely be far better than those filthy, chaotic, and backwoods cities." Although Tony hadn't seen it in person, he'd heard about the general situation of this world from others. While there were magical powers like magic, gods, and alchemy, the standard of living wasn't much different from that of medieval Europe on Earth. The living conditions of ordinary people in this world were just so-so, and definitely not happy. In comparison, having David, a man with advanced ideas, rule and build a brand new, advanced nation was definitely a good thing for the average person in this world. Besides, you've got a genius like me to help you. After a few boasts and small talk, David got down to business. When Tony heard David actually wanted him to help build agricultural robots, he didn't know where to begin his complaints. He could certainly build them, but the machines he'd built could be used for more important things. Wouldn't it be a waste to use them to plow the fields? They'll farm in their spare time while on guard duty and guarding the post. So, iron soldiers who know how to farm? Don't you think that's even more wasteful? David spread his hands. Even if transformers could be modified into agricultural machinery, the true way to maximize their value would be to cultivate the more fertile land around Wintertown, rather than sending them to Frostbite to cultivate the barren fields. Until all the land around Wintertown was utilized, any action would be a waste of labor. I think you should send some extra support personnel to help with farming during their free time. Besides combat soldiers, an outpost should have support staff like cooks and others. They could just farm when they're free, and that's it. They didn't expect much food from the farmland anyway. The population wasn't large before, so he didn't consider it. He hadn't planned to send support personnel to the outpost, given the frequent rotations of soldiers stationed there. After hearing David's words, Tony immediately guessed. What? Have you found a new way to increase the population? Yeah, a new guy just arrived. After giving Tony a brief overview of Rick's situation, Tony immediately understood David's intentions. Even if Rick can help you recruit civilians to Wintertown, the number won't be huge, will it? As long as the population grows steadily, that's fine. David had moved on from the topic of having the Iron Soldiers work on the farm. Instead, he brought up another matter. Wintertown's crops were almost harvested, and the winter festival he'd mentioned was almost time to begin. He asked Tony to consider who should be invited to Wintertown and take time to greet them. It shouldn't be too many. I'm only inviting the Avengers, at most. They could include Rhoda, Pepper Potts, and Happy. He wasn't sure if the other Avengers would bring their families. If they did, would the God of Thunder call his own family from Asgard? Chapter 211 Black Ship. As it turned out, the gods of Asgard weren't so idle. Each had their own work to do. Only Thor, the first heir to the throne of Asgard, who was obsessed with Jane Foster's body, stayed on Earth all day. After completing the harvest, David announced the official birth of Wintertown to all the residents of Wintertown. He also established that the Winter Festival would be celebrated after the final harvest of each year. David had initially thought that townspeople wouldn't take such a holiday seriously. However, as long as there was a seemingly legitimate reason for celebration, the public's acceptance was much greater than David had anticipated. Everyone excitedly celebrated this new holiday, perhaps also celebrating the beginning of a new life. For the residents of Wintertown, the official opening of Wintertown truly marked a fresh start. They received new homes, new land, new jobs, and a fresh start to their lives. The artisans from Azeroth bid a final farewell to the past and could now enjoy a stable, comfortable, and prosperous life in Wintertown. David had fulfilled all he had promised the artisans. It could be said that the most supportive of Lord David in Wintertown right now are the artisans and their families, former servants of Edwin Van Cleve. These individuals have become David's foundation for establishing his position in Wintertown. While praising Baron David Glamorgan, the artisans also furiously criticized the nobles of Stormwind and King Varian Rin. Andrin, mingling with the crowd, felt a slight embarrassment, but inwardly, he gradually understood what it meant to be a good king. He joined everyone else in joyfully enjoying this newly born festival. However, the creator of this festival was anything but happy. He found himself, as the host, incredibly busy, with no time to spare. He was either welcoming new guests or heading off to greet the next. He raced through the back gardens of Castle Glamorgan, his hands melting David's ice juice into warm juice. The Avengers, their friends, the Transformers, Lennox and Epps, who had a former battlefield friendship, Michaela and her daughter, who had no real connection but had come to Wintertown through the Transformers, King Darius of Sparta and his queen Leda, Peter Parker, accompanied by his own version of Gwen Stacy, and Gwen's father, George Stacy, who expressed sincere gratitude to David for saving his life. Meanwhile, the two Gwen Stacys met, seemingly discussing their differences. David wanted to approach, but circumstances prevented him. He flitted around the party, fearing that Optimus Prime, who had been trying to talk to him, would suddenly shout, "Please stay." Thankfully, that didn't happen. By the time the party was halfway through, David had finally greeted all the guests and could relax a bit. Is throwing a party really that tiring? Of course not. A normal party would be this tiring, but your situation here is unusual. Steve and Tony stood nearby, watching the excitement unfold. I think situations like yours only happen at parties hosted by presidents and governors. The two found common ground in watching David frantically. After downing the warm juice in his hand, David grabbed a fresh glass from a passing Spartan maid, completely ignoring Tony's disdainful gaze. With your physique, drinking alcohol wouldn't be much different from drinking juice, right? Yeah, but I prefer the taste of juice. David had no preference for alcohol. In his past life, he'd been forced to drink even when he didn't want to, especially at social events where he'd been forced to drink even when he didn't want to. That left a bad impression on him. Now that he could make his own decisions, he certainly wouldn't make things difficult for himself. Well, after all, you're the Lord, the boss. As long as you don't ban alcohol in Wintertown, I have no objections. Tony glanced at Optimus Prime as he passed by. The Cybertronians were conspicuous by their height and size, and even pretending not to see them was impossible. Looks like you have something to discuss. No need to avoid them, Optimus Prime said, stopping Tony and Steve as they tried to avoid him. He felt that what he and David were discussing was nothing secretive. As for the identities of the two people before him, the biggest benefit of David's party today was that it allowed these previously unrelated people from different worlds to get to know each other. Especially for Transformers, who hold a special place in the hearts of many, everyone who came here would almost certainly come up to Optimus Prime to get to know the Autobot leader. At this point in the party, besides David greeting everyone, Optimus Prime was the busiest, which was why he hadn't come yet. Optimus Prime approached David to discuss the Autobots' arrival in Wintertown. The suggestion of a human alliance had been made, but the humans were too slow to implement it. Optimus Prime had noticed the growing hostility of some Earthlings toward the Autobots. Therefore, he planned to relocate some Autobots to Wintertown, leaving only a few capable of self-defense on Earth. The Decepticon corpses you mentioned earlier might take some time. Lately, the bodies of the Decepticons we've eliminated have been removed for inexplicable reasons. Is that so? David, upon hearing Optimus Prime's words, immediately realized that humans might be using the Decepticon corpses for research. After all, the Autobots were his allies, so he warned Optimus, this could mean someone is using these bodies for some kind of experiment. I think the Autobots must be careful. As the Decepticons become fewer and fewer, they'll target you. Optimus Prime was silent for a few seconds. He'd considered this possibility, but he didn't want it to come to that. He had a good impression of humans, especially now that he had many human friends and comrades. Without concrete evidence, he wouldn't have thought too badly of them. However, as a leader, he knew what to do. The fact that he'd specifically discussed this with David proved he was wary. After a few more words, Optimus Prime introduced David to two humans. Besides the mini-cons like Brainiac and Wheelie, Michaela and her father wanted to start a new life in Wintertown and wondered if there were any suitable jobs for them. David thought carefully and realized there were indeed suitable jobs. The Winter Order currently had a number of vehicles, but there was only one person in Wintertown who knew how to repair them, Tony Stark. This was quite awkward. As the Winter Order's mechanical equipment grew, the need for maintenance personnel would increase. Michaela and her father could handle the situation for a while, and they could also teach the people of Wintertown how to repair vehicles. Such a small matter was settled in a few words, and Wintertown's population also increased during the party. As the party drew to a close, even Robert Epps, a member of the Hive, expressed interest in staying, but hadn't yet made a final decision. David wasn't in a rush. Epps could take his time to consider it. He even welcomed his comrades who had retired or were about to leave the service. Wintertown had plenty of empty houses. Even if they were full, he could always have Digger build more. There was more open space in Wintertown than empty houses. He longed for the day when all those empty spaces would be filled. Today, he'd start by filling Eva's place. Winterfest was a day worth celebrating, and there was no need for him and Eva to waste any more time. He'd already built a bonfire that was already burning brightly. It would soon burn out. Eva had been looking forward to this day. When David made it clear he'd meet her later, she'd left the party early to prepare. When David returned to his room, he was greeted by Eva, fully armed and clad in pure white armor, lying on a bed of rose petals. Wow, day by day. Refreshed and relieved, David looked at Eva, who had fallen into a deep, energetic sleep. He got up, washed, and dressed, ready to begin the day's work. He had barely finished washing and hadn't even had time to change when Gareth Stanton's slightly anxious voice rang out from outside. "My lord, this is an emergency." David knew that this Knight of the Royal Guard wouldn't be knocking on his door so early unless it was an emergency. Slipping into a robe, David opened the door and walked straight out of the bedroom. After knocking on the door, Gareth Stanton stood aside, his head lowered as if observing the carpet beneath his feet, making sure he didn't see anything he shouldn't. He quickly explained to David why he had come so early to knock on the door. "My lord, a ship has appeared on the Winter River." A ship? David was stunned, then realized the situation was indeed quite urgent. Coming from the Ironwater River. The Ironwater River is the river that flows out of the Ironwood Forest and joins the Winter River just southwest of Wintertown. If it was coming from that direction, could it be an elven warship? No, it's coming from downstream. Oh, from the lower reaches of the Winter River. That means it's coming from the west. West, yes, I see. Let RC take a look at the situation first. Once I'm dressed, I'll go and see for myself. Have the knights prepare for battle. David moved quickly. After getting dressed, he arrived at the newly built dock on the Winter River and looked west. Across the vast river, a black ship was slowly sailing towards Wintertown. Chapter 212 Dark Elf Brothers and Sisters. It was completely black, without sails, and David couldn't see a paddle wheel. RC, can you see the crew aboard? RC, transformed into an A-10 attack aircraft, circled above the black ship, performing various scans and quickly transmitting the information. David, in his Cybertronium body, could receive this data. Through RC's transmissions, he discovered that this was a very advanced ship compared to this world, powered by an unfamiliar energy source. This energy seemed to have some anti-detection capabilities. RC could only scan the ship's general outline and detect an unknown energy source, but couldn't detect anything more. As David stood on the newly built dock, observing the black ship, Optimus Prime, Tony, Steve, and others received the news and arrived one after another. Because of the Winter Festival, many people did not return directly to their own worlds, but stayed overnight in Wintertown. Some planned to stay longer to explore this magical place, others, having drunk too much the previous night, were unable to leave. A completely unfamiliar ship? Or something else? Tony Stark, clad in his Iron Man armor, scanned the area using its onboard scanners. He then glanced at David, who was standing beside him, and scanned David in his Cybertronian form. Noticing Tony's actions, David gave him a speechless look, knowing that no matter what he said, he wouldn't be able to stop him from doing what he wanted. That's just the way he is. If he could change, he wouldn't be Tony Stark. As you can see, a strange, black ship of unknown origin. Oh, a black ship from nowhere, perhaps disrupting the peace of Wintertown and even the Kingdom of Tiran. I've read about that in books, so have I. David didn't want his city gates blasted open by naval guns, even though Wintertown didn't have any. David was debating whether to transform into Tomcat and intercept the black ship when RC came through again. Someone appeared on the deck. They look a bit like elves. The image information was transmitted simultaneously to David's vision, and David also saw two elves with blue skin and silver hair appear on the deck of the black ship. Dark elves. Their appearance was not exactly the same as the dark elves he had seen in his previous life, but it was almost indistinguishable. Turning to Pierre, who had also arrived, David used his eyes to release a holographic image of a dark elf and asked Pierre, "Is this a dark elf?" Pierre only glanced at them and gave a reply that left David speechless. "I haven't seen a dark elf either." Then, an unexpected person confirmed the answer, Missionary Rains, who had recently arrived in Wintertown with the intention of establishing a temple and spreading the teachings of the temple. Indeed, it is a dark elf. Missionary Rains had been in Wintertown for some time, and he felt a little unsure about how to proceed in this town on the border of the Kingdom of Tiran. Although he had purchased a piece of land and hired craftsmen from Wintertown to build a temple, the residents of Wintertown had no intention of accepting the teachings of the temple gods. Compared to the gods of the temple, they favored the so-called holy light. Rains had been struggling lately, striving to integrate himself into Wintertown, aiming to attract a small number of followers first and then gradually expand. Therefore, he would participate in any excitement in Wintertown, and naturally, he would not miss the excitement at the docks. He was surprised to see a dark elf there. While he didn't know what Baron Glamorgan was doing, the dark elf's presence intrigued him more than anything else. Why were they there? Could the river near Wintertown lead to desolate land inhabited by the dark elves? The direction of the river seemed plausible, but a new question arose. Why did the dark elves possess such a strange black ship? What was the purpose here? Could they be seeking to conquer the territory north of the Kingdom of Tiran? Rains's mind raced with questions, but no one could answer them. Meanwhile, David, having determined the other party's race, was conversing with RC. Fire a threatening sweep of the water ahead of the black ship to force it to stop. How about I board the ship and inquire about the elves' intentions? RC, still circling, could clearly see the two dark elves on deck, pointing at her curiously. I don't think they have any ill intentions. It's better to be cautious. After all, we've never encountered dark elves, and we don't know what the dark elves on this ship are planning to do in Wintertown. I understand. RC then fired at the water ahead of the black ship and loudly warned the dark elves, "You are about to invade Wintertown territory. Please stop and state your intentions. Failure to do so will be considered a declaration of war." To ensure the other party didn't understand, RC shouted these words at the top of her lungs. As she spoke, a question suddenly occurred to her. Could these dark elves understand the common language of Brunia? Fortunately, after the female dark elf rushed into the cabin, the ship below gradually slowed down. Meanwhile, the male dark elf waved his arms and shouted to RC, who was circling in the air, "We are archaeologists from the Empire of Eternal Night. We mean no harm." Though his voice was accented, it was indeed the common language of Brunnian. David, through RC, instructed the black ship to maintain minimum speed and slowly approach the dock. Meanwhile, defensive positions had been set up at the dock. After so long, not only had the heavily armed Winter Knights, clad in power armor, arrived, but Autobots like Ironhide and Bumblebee had also arrived to assist, establishing defensive positions at the dock. Meanwhile, Tony ordered the Iron Legion to stand by. If the situation arose, at least 20 Iron soldiers could be flown in from Stark Manor immediately. In an emergency, the underground production line could quickly assemble an additional 50 Iron soldiers. The Quinjet had already taken off, and Peggy and Sharon, the two super soldiers, were ready for airborne operations. After confirming that Wintertown was prepared for any emergency, David confidently let the black ship dock. Meanwhile, he'd mentally simulated the likely conversation, but he hadn't expected it to start like this. "Look, it's a human, with the same blue skin, long silver hair tied in a ponytail, and armor that accentuated her impressive figure and possessed exceptionally high defense." This female dark elf, upon stepping onto the dock and observing the crowd around her, acted as if she had spotted some rare animal. "I'm sorry, my sister was so rude." The male dark elf had a very handsome face, a slender figure, and neatly combed silver hair. "I am Cecil, an archaeologist from the Eternal Night Empire, and this is my sister Enid. I am Baron David Glamorgan, Lord of Wintertown, under the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Tiran." David always mentioned the Kingdom of Tiran in passing. "Welcome to Wintertown. May I ask what brings you here, Mr. Cecil?" As I introduced myself, "I'm an archaeologist. I'm here to search for ancient ruins and uncover forgotten historical information." Cecil repeatedly stated that he was not here to provoke war, and that only his brother and sister were aboard his ship. "Believe me, we hold no ill will towards you or the city you rule." David carefully studied the dark elf before him, but he saw no flaws in his expression. Of course, if he were a spy sent by the dark elves, he wouldn't have been able to detect any flaws so easily. Since they couldn't detect any problems, David, treating them as genuine archaeologists, sent the surrounding soldiers and Autobots packing while giving Edwin Van Cleef a look. Van Cleef knew what to do, while he himself chatted with the two dark elves, hoping to gain more information. He led the two dark elves to Castle Glamorgan, where a reception hall on the first floor served as a perfect place for them. Along the way, the two dark elves expressed great curiosity, especially the female dark elf named Enid, whose mind raced endlessly. As David gave them various orders, the two dark elves noticed that the metal giants, which they had previously thought were mere war puppets, possessed remarkable intelligence, even capable of transforming into unusually shaped vehicles. Enid seemed about to ask a question, but Cecil stopped her. Only after both parties entered the reception hall, where they were seated and served drinks and fruit, did they begin their formal conversation. The topic began with the origins of the Dark Elves. The Empire of Eternal Night? What kind of country is that? It's an advanced country founded by the Dark Elves that rules the entire western part of the Bronia continent. Cecil's tone and demeanor when he mentioned the Empire of Eternal Night showed how proud he was of his country. The western part of the Bronia continent, David thought of the distribution of various countries and ethnic groups on the continent that Pierre had introduced to him. He remembered that Pierre said the West was an area known as the Savage Lands, where the terrain was complex and the land was barren, so the Kingdom of Holy God had never occupied it. Is it the Savage Lands? The Savage Lands? Cecil was confused by the name. Elias took out a map and placed it in front of Cecil, pointing to one of the areas. Cecil looked at it for a moment before realizing, "You mean the Lost Lands?" "No, the Empire of Eternal Night is located west of the Lost Lands." Chapter 213 Intelligence Agency and the Winter Navy. According to Cecil's description, the Lost Lands were the exiled region for Dark Elves who betrayed the Evernight Empire, abandoning their faith and race. The Dark Elves living in the Lost Lands were despised by all Dark Elves. Is that so? David planned to find an opportunity to ask Rains later. Perhaps he could get more information about the Dark Elves from the missionary. For now, he continued chatting with Cecil, learning from him how powerful the Evernight Empire was. He also learned that the black ship Cecil had previously piloted was powered by a type of energy called dark energy. Dark energy, Dark energy is the greatest technology in Dark Elves history. Although Cecil's explanation was not very clear or detailed, David still understood the general idea. This energy, called dark energy, was derived from the Dark Elves' specialized technology, converting various energies, including arcane energy, into energy. The purpose, of course, was to facilitate their own use. The utilization of this energy permeated every aspect of the Evernight Empire, not just ships but also vehicles. This was why the two Dark Elves weren't surprised to see the Autobots transform into vehicles, but simply found their appearance rather unusual. Things like this were common in the Eternal Night Empire. David unconsciously rubbed his chin, a sense of wonder rising in his heart. According to the siblings, the Eternal Night Empire's level of civilization far surpassed the human nations east of the Bronia continent, so why hadn't it ever moved eastward? We Dark Elves are a peace-loving race and don't easily start wars. Watching Cecil's peaceful speech, and the female Dark Elf from Enid solemnly nodding in agreement, David decided not to pursue the topic further. He began to inquire about the purpose of the siblings' trip. The mention of archaeology immediately perked up the siblings, especially Cecil, who always maintained his personal appearance, even speaking in a calm tone and polite language. Only then did he reveal a bit of youthful energy. I've been interested in history since I was a child. After years of study, I became an archaeologist, exploring historical records that have been lost for various reasons. According to Cecil, he became a scholar in adulthood, diligently studying various historical texts and nearly memorizing every historical document of the Eternal Night Empire. As a result of this, he unexpectedly discovered numerous conflicts and gaps in historical records, even containing various errors. This was perfectly normal for historical records, but Cecil suddenly felt a sense of responsibility as the Eternal Night Empire's best historian, as he called himself, to improve and restore these historical materials. Thus, Cecil embarked on an archaeological expedition. So far, he's been doing quite well, unearthing much lost and forgotten historical information. Some of this information has led him eastward, where he might find even more. So, Enid and I came here together. Is this your original destination? Weren't you just looking to the east? Yes, to the northern tip of the eastern continent, where there's a towering mountain. Cecil stated his destination directly, the northern peak. The clues I've uncovered over the years reveal a portion of Dark Elf history before the founding of the Eternal Night Empire. According to Cecil, long ago, the entire Bronia continent was ruled by Dark Elves. A time when humans were largely absent. However, intense internal conflict among the Dark Elves, coupled with the rise of humans, led some to retreat to the western part of the continent, establishing the Empire of Eternal Night. Others dispersed, and the information he had found indicated that a powerful group of renegade Dark Elves had retreated to the northeastern peaks. For some reason, David suddenly thought of the two altars he had discovered. Could they have been left behind by the Dark Elves? He continued chatting with Cecil, and as they became more familiar with each other, Enid joined in the conversation, but David was unable to extract any further information from the siblings. Neither sibling was certain whether there were Dark Elves on the northern peaks. They had simply followed a clue. As for humans, the Dark Elves had little record of them, describing them as a backward, barbaric race prone to infighting, who had taken advantage of the Dark Elf civil unrest to occupy the eastern part of the continent. These weren't the siblings' actual words, but rather information David had carefully condensed. Even so, he noticed that two Dark Elves' expressions were rather odd, perhaps because they found their comments about humans too awkward to be spoken in front of a human. After chatting for a while longer, and seeing that it was almost noon, David invited the two Dark Elves to the restaurant for dinner. After inquiring beforehand about any dietary restrictions among the Dark Elves, the arduous task of cooking was handed over to Jonah. Jonah was already an accomplished chef, and after arriving in Wintertown, he adapted to the locals by learning and creating new dishes tailored to the local tastes. Fortunately, Dark Elves have no dietary restrictions, and the siblings expressed a desire to try the local specialties. At the table, besides David, the Lord of Wintertown, Laura, an archaeologist, was also present, chatting with Cecil about archaeology. After lunch, I'll show you around Wintertown. Since they had a common topic, Laura offered to guide the siblings around Wintertown. Of course, Laura also secretly winked at David, as if to say, "See how I can help you extract more information." After lunch, as Laura was taking the Dark Elves for a stroll, Edwin Van Cleef appeared before David. Back in the office, David, sipping tea and enjoying a dessert of fruit Helen Hyde sent, inquired about the black ship. Sir, there are indeed some weapons on board, but they are mostly personal defensive weapons, and the number is not large. Cold weapons or firearms, from the looks of it, cold weapons, sir. Van Cleef hadn't touched the weapons to avoid alerting the enemy, so he had no idea if these seemingly normal swords were anything special. What's the arrangement with Rains? I recently recruited some new people, one of whom, Wilcox, has gone to approach the missionary. Oh, David had considered forming a professional intelligence unit from the beginning. In fact, the initial form of such a unit already existed, and it had recently begun to operate under Van Cleef's command. It wasn't officially decided on a name, though. David had thought of several names in his spare time, such as MI9, Hammer, and Wolf's Den, but none of them suited his taste. He probably would go with the traditional name of Winter Intelligence. Do you think I should establish an observation and warning post on the other side of the Winter River? His attention had previously been focused on the east and south, the vast expanse of the Winter River, giving him the illusion that no threat would suddenly emerge from that direction. But the appearance of the Dark Elf siblings sounded a warning bell for him. He had been paying too little attention to this direction. Yes, my lord. Van Cleef also felt that Wintertown's defenses to the west were too weak. Previously, he could have claimed there were no hostile forces in that direction, but the reality was that anyone, any force, could emerge from this direction. After all, they hadn't even properly scouted the land across the Winter River. We need to build up our navy, too. David preferred to do things piecemeal, completing one task before moving on to the next. But the reality is that when you try to do things piecemeal, more things will arise to distract you. As a lord, he must learn and adapt to handling multiple tasks simultaneously, otherwise, he won't be a competent ruler. After Van Cleef left, David went to see James Norrington. The former Royal Navy Commodore hadn't been idling away since arriving in Wintertown, quietly awaiting David's recruitment. Instead, he was using every available moment to enrich himself. Ever since arriving in Wintertown and encountering all sorts of bizarre things, he knew he needed to learn a lot if he wanted to stay afloat. Elizabeth and Will offered him similar advice. To become a valuable member of Wintertown, you must learn many new things. Relying solely on your past skills is simply not enough. So, in addition to learning the common language of Brunnian, language learning tools didn't exist back then. Norrington devoted himself to acquiring a wide range of new knowledge. Like Fording, Norrington not only read books but also began to absorb video games, movies, television, and animation, ensuring his tactical theories remained current and providing a more intuitive understanding of advanced weaponry. Therefore, when David reunited with a Royal Commodore, he was no longer the Royal Commodore from the Age of Sail, but a former Royal Commodore obsessed with video games. Fortunately, Norrington hadn't forgotten his original aspirations. His fascination with these things was to establish himself in Wintertown. So, when David approached him, Norrington quickly spruced up his appearance, donning clean, tidy clothes, and prepared to face the Lord's test. Test? What test, sir? Aren't you going to test my professional ability? You are the only naval commander in the entire Wintertown. Apart from you, there is not even a fisherman who can fish. Do I have anyone else to use besides you? Chapter 214, The First Battleship of the Winter Navy. Wintertown's docks were complete, but not a single ship docked there. Besides the lack of a shipyard, the key factor was a lack of demand. As for shipbuilding designers and workers, Wintertown did have them, members of the over 400 craftsmen from Azeroth. If David hadn't sent Fordring to the defious Brotherhood to meddle, Van Cleef would have mobilized the Brotherhood's craftsmen to build a massive, powerful warship, destined to completely destroy Stormwind. The craftsman's skill in designing and building such a formidable warship was undeniable, yet Wintertown still hadn't begun shipbuilding because there was no one to use it. Wintertown's population was growing, but those recruited from the northern plains were all driven by the desire to acquire land. Of the few recruits from other worlds, only James Norrington was a legitimate naval officer. Further down the list, Will Turner and Elizabeth Swan had to be included. Even so, there were only 3 of them. So, your task is daunting, David patted James Norrington's shoulder, whose expression had changed several times. You have to build a navy from scratch. As for ships, that was easy to solve. Even if David didn't like the wooden sailing warships built by the craftsmen, he could go to the Transformers, the Marvel Universe, or Laura's World and learn some modern and contemporary warship technology. Given Wintertown's current situation, small ships would suffice. I wonder which transformers can transform into ships. He thought about it. There didn't seem to be any transformers that could transform into warships in the movie version. Maybe there were some in the setting? There seemed to be a transformer submarine in the 5th film, but it didn't transform. As for the animation, he only remembered the Wave, which could transform into hovercraft, and the triple transformer gun, broadside gun, who was afraid of water and heights but could transform into an aircraft carrier and fighter plane. I may need to discuss the warship issue with others before I can give you a definitive answer. David looked at Norrington before him. The former Commodore showed no dissatisfaction with the dire situation he faced. But you can begin the preliminary preparations for recruiting and training soldiers. How many men should be recruited? What kind of training should be conducted? What equipment and resources are needed? James Norrington needs to sort out these matters and report them to David. The Lord will then decide whether to provide full support or increase the amount. I will submit the report to you as soon as possible. Yes, David nodded, and officially appointed James Norrington as the Commander-in-Chief of the Winterstown Navy. As for rank and other matters, he hadn't yet figured it out. That would be discussed later. Seeing James Norrington eagerly preparing to formulate his plan, David took his leave. He had originally considered seeking Tony Stark, but after some thought, he decided to go to Optimus Prime. Transform into a battleship, Optimus Prime was a bit puzzled. The Autobots were called Autobots because their vehicles were mostly in the form of cars. Airplanes and ships were uncommon in the Autobot world. Battleship? I can transform into one, huh? David looked in the direction of the voice and noticed a Blackbird fighter jet parked nearby. This was Jetfire, one of the first Autobots to move into Wintertown. Unlike Gears and Brainiac, Jetfire was a formidable transformer and one of the oldest. The passage of time had rusted his body and weakened his spark, leaving him dormant for a long time before Optimus Prime found him in the museum. Optimus had sought out Jetfire to find the leadership module, as only ancient transformers like him knew where it was hidden. Despite David's warning, Optimus and his companions still couldn't avoid Jetfire as they followed the clues. Ultimately, Optimus Prime successfully located the leadership module and the stellar energy collector. Optimus Prime had dismantled the machine, and the leadership module was carried by him. As for Jetfire, due to his age, he wasn't considered a combatant by Optimus Prime. Instead, he was assigned to retirement in Wintertown, like the mini-cons. David, upon seeing Jetfire retire in Wintertown, had simply assumed that Optimus Prime had missed the opportunity to become Skyfire Prime. He never expected a surprise to await him. Can you transform into a battleship? Of course, I've transformed into a destroyer before. The Blackbird fighter emitted a series of teeth-grinding noises, and Jetfire used his hands for additional assistance to complete his transformation. Give me a suitable battleship to scan, and I can still transform into one. Jetfire appeared confident, but his body language made this assurance seem unconvincing. After staggering a few times, Jetfire sat down on the ground. Fortunately, the ground had been specially reinforced, preventing the tall, elderly transformer from making a dent. I might need some energy to do that. Jetfire wasn't just old and aging, more importantly, his spark had grown utterly weak. Optimus Prime had sent Jetfire here, perhaps with the intention of asking David to use his magical holy light to replenish Jetfire's energy. He didn't expect Jetfire to return to peak strength and become the Autobots' primary fighting force. If only this knowledgeable old King Kong could pass on the rich knowledge stored in his brain, it would be a tremendous asset to the Autobots. If it's just energy, that's easy enough. I'm afraid it's not as simple as you think, young human. Jetfire looked at David. He could see the terrifying, immense amount of energy contained within the human before him. While he didn't understand how a human could store such a vast amount of energy, he knew how weak he was. Restoring him now would require far more energy than a Cybertronian in his prime. I'll need a vast amount of energy. That's not a problem. David wasn't sure if his current power was sufficient, but even if it wasn't, he could still take Jetfire to Azeroth. He knew the place well. In that world, he could easily mobilize terrifying energies. Not to mention one Skyfire, he could easily handle two. Oh? I'm looking forward to it. David didn't waste time choosing an auspicious day. He immediately transformed into Cybertron form before Skyfire, unleashing his Tomcat fighter to complete the combined transformation. This Cybertron body could withstand even more violent energy output, allowing David to unleash Holy Light at a power level exceeding its output limit. Watching David transform before him, Skyfire expressed a hint of surprise. Oh? A hermit warrior, a leader warrior, and a supreme. David didn't respond. He raised his hand and released a beam of holy light. A golden beam connected him to Skyfire. As the energy continued to flow in, Skyfire felt his body revitalized. Oh, this feeling is wonderful. It felt as if endless energy poured into his own flame, making his faint, flaming flame glow brightly once again. The revival of the fire sparked a series of changes in Jetfire's body. The rust and scars on it vanished at a visible speed. His initial sense of weakness gradually faded, and Jetfire not only stood up again, but even held his head high and no longer hunched over. The parts that had served as his crutch returned to his body, and he felt he no longer needed it. Although he lacked a mirror, as a transformer, he could clearly see everything about his body, and he noticed that his face was beginning to look younger. Is this the holy light? It's a mighty force like a star. As the golden beam dissipated, a brand new Jetfire stood beside Optimus Prime. He clenched his fist, and the feeling of power that filled him made him feel like he had been reborn into Cybertron's most glorious era, when he was at his most powerful. Seeing Jetfire's return to his peak, David secretly groaned. Restoring an ancient, dying Condor to its peak is no easy task. He had nearly drained all of his strength, but fortunately, it wasn't lost forever. It could be restored with time. However, next time, I'd better do this kind of thing in Azeroth. At most, I'd get a few scoldings from that guy, which wouldn't be a big deal. Do you have any special requirements for a warship? Jetfire moved around a bit, even activating his energy shield at full power. After confirming he was truly back to peak condition, he asked David what kind of ship he wanted him to become. Even if it was just to repay him for giving him a new life, Jetfire would definitely stay in Wintertown for the rest of his life. A warship that can anchor on the Winter River and maneuver freely on the river. I understand. Jetfire would then follow Optimus Prime back to Earth in his world to search for a warship of the right size, which would then become the first warship of the Wintertown Navy. This would barely solve the problem of Wintertown's surface combat capability, and provide sufficient surface combat capabilities until the Navy was established. After chatting with Optimus Prime for a few more words and saying goodbye, David went to Stark Manor. It was much busier here than Optimus Prime's place, as the Avengers and their families were still staying in Wintertown. Pepper Potts and Jane Foster, led by Peggy and Sharon, were strolling through Wintertown, taking in the fresh air and beautiful scenery of this otherworldly town. The men gathered together to chat. David greeted everyone and then went straight to Tony Stark. Tony, do you want to open a shipyard in Wintertown? Chapter 215 Skyfire Light Cruiser. Shipyard. Do you want me to help you build warships? Tony Stark immediately guessed David's intention. He thought of the immense breadth and seemingly considerable depth of the Winter River beside Wintertown, which, at present, seemed to offer a direct route to the Dark Elves' Evernight Empire. Given this situation, it wasn't surprising that David wanted to develop a navy. Stark Industries hasn't taken on the warship business yet. I might need some time to figure out what it takes to build one. Because the ships were being built in Wintertown, he couldn't simply import the necessary technology, purchase factories, and hire the necessary personnel, as he did in his own world. Tony Stark insisted on using automated production lines in Wintertown, relying on the artificial intelligence Jarvis to manage them. The main reason was that he could handle it all by himself. Another important reason was that, not long ago, Tony had envisioned himself becoming Wintertown's primary arms supplier, helping David establish the Kingdom of Winter, or even the Winter Empire, and ultimately unify the world. Now his thoughts had shifted slightly. He felt that helping David build a vast empire wasn't such a bad thing for the world, and that in the process, he could constantly demonstrate his own value, which would be a positive experience for him personally. What kind of warship do you want to build? Battleship? Aircraft carrier? Missile destroyer? No need to be so exaggerated. The Winter River was vast. Standing on this side of the river, in even the most inclement weather, you couldn't see the other side. This vastness gave the illusion of being at the seaside. David had also explored upstream for a while. Based on the area he had explored, the Winter River's width, while narrower than at the corner near Wintertown, was still astonishing. It was arguably wide enough to accommodate any type of surface vessel on Earth. The real limitation on these vessels appearing on the Winter River was probably the water depth. He needed to conduct additional research on this aspect, and perhaps coming to Tony with the idea of asking him to procure some detection equipment. Even if you build an aircraft carrier, Wintertown currently lacks the sailors in naval aviation. David's idea was to initially rely on warships transformed from Skyfire as the primary combat force, supplemented by smaller vessels manned by sailors trained by James Norrington. Then, as they trained and cultivated more sailors, they would simultaneously construct larger and more powerful warships. By the time the sailors were nearly fully trained, the Navy should have a rudimentary structure. He didn't need to worry about the Navy being trapped in a river. From the Dark Elf Cecil's description, David knew that sailing west along the Winter River would lead to the sea. In other words, Wintertown actually had an outlet to the sea, and the Winter Navy was a true navy. So, you just want me to build some small boats, large ships, too? David figured since Tony wasn't satisfied with just small boats, he'd paint a bigger picture for him, even spaceships in the future. Tony looked at him like he was kidding. Spaceships and surface ships are completely different. They're all ships. There's no difference. David noticed Tony had a look on his face that said, "I'm not stupid, I wouldn't believe you," but his eyes darted around, clearly tempted. A scientist like Tony couldn't resist the allure of advanced technology and its application. Building spaceships wouldn't be easy in his own world, as the obstacles were numerous. But in Wintertown, not only would he have the full support of David, the Overlord, but he'd also have immediate access to advanced technology from other worlds. Cybertronian technology alone would be enough for him to study for a while. In Wintertown, he could even directly learn from the Cybertronians about their technical knowledge. How could he have those advantages back home? Small ships, huh? Leave it to me. He didn't have to worry about the raw materials. The Cybertronians at Digger could easily provide him with them in bulk. All Tony had to do was design a properly automated shipyard. But there's a problem. What will these ships be powered by? Well, large warships on Earth all use heavy fuel oil. Smaller boats use diesel, with a few using gasoline. He hadn't found such a thing in Wintertown, and of course, he hadn't specifically looked for it. Let's use crystal ore. David felt that crystal ore was the primary resource Goldfinger had given him. Whether used as an energy source or a reinforcement material, it was extremely effective. If the current inventory wasn't insufficient, he wouldn't have needed Tony to help him build the arc reactor. Of course, the construction of the arc reactor not only ensured Wintertown's basic electricity needs, but also allowed David to use the crystal ore for specific purposes, weapons and energy. As for the use of the crystal ore engines developed by Sheldon, Leonard, and Howard had been continuously refined and upgraded, and had undergone a major upgrade since Tony's arrival. The latest third-generation crystal engines fully meet David's requirements. Tony has even begun considering upgrading the Harrier fighter in Wintertown to one with a crystal engine for comprehensive testing. After discussing the shipyard, David had resolved the Winter Navy's issue. Next, he awaited James Norrington's report and provided him with all the necessary support as required. To David's surprise, he had only chatted briefly with the Avengers when, by the time he left Stark Manor, Jetfire had returned. "You're incredibly efficient. It's just scanning a few battleships. It shouldn't take that long." More importantly, Jetfire, now back in peak form, could use his teleportation abilities with relative ease, allowing him to reach his target in record time. "I originally wanted to scan the USS New Jersey, but it's a bit too big, can't transform into a battleship." David remembered that Cybertron's compression technology was exceptionally robust in this regard. The platoon's normal size wasn't much larger than other Autobots, but once transformed into an aircraft carrier, it could accommodate a large number of Autobots. "It's not that I can't transform, but overusing compression and amplification techniques will affect my structural strength and waste more fire energy," Skyfire explained. "It's not that I can't transform, but becoming too large would compromise my combat effectiveness." If a platoon of artillery transformed into an aircraft carrier could still serve as a transport, then Skyfire's forced transformation into a massive battleship would be practically meaningless. "So, which ship did you choose?" "I scanned an old battleship in a place called London, and it's the perfect size." Skyfire and David arrived at the Wintertown docks, and under David's watchful eye, Skyfire transformed into a light cruiser. David had guessed the ship when he'd heard about the old battleship in London, and seeing the ship Skyfire had transformed into, it was exactly what he'd imagined. HMS Belfast. The light cruiser was currently anchored in the river not far from the docks. Due to its draft, Skyfire couldn't dock at the docks. Seeing this, David realized the docks needed to be expanded and renovated, and a new military dock would be necessary. There were more things to do, so he silently noted them down and wrote them down in his schedule when he got back, so he wouldn't forget them when things got busy. He asked Skyfire about his condition, and he said he was in great shape. His spark was strong and his energy was abundant. Right now, he could single-handedly fight against hundreds of Decepticons. With his help in the defense, no one or any force could possibly attack Wintertown from the Winter River. By the way, I'll be staying here from now on. It's nice here, and I can get some sun. Skyfire said David could just go about his business, and he'd stay on the river. He could just come find him by the river when needed. While David had a bad temper and his health had returned to peak form, he was still a very old transformer. When he had nothing to do, quietly basking in the sun was a very pleasant experience for Skyfire. Furthermore, Wintertown's tranquil and beautiful natural scenery greatly soothed his emotions. As long as no one was messing with him, he could be quite calm. David stood on the shore, watching Skyfire, now silent and unsure if he was asleep, for a moment. He then asked Elias to inform the townspeople about the Skyfire transformed warship moored on the river. It would be best if they posted a notice or something, telling the townspeople that the massive metal warship on the river belonged to Wintertown and that there was no need to panic or worry. Eva usually handled this kind of messenger, but since she wasn't home today, David delegated it to Elias. The ceremonial officer knew what was going on, and since David had said he needed to return to Castle Glamorgan for a while, Elias, the ceremonial officer, could leave for a while. So, Elias went to find Weatherby, while David headed towards Castle Glamorgan. Eva had just woken up, and the light filtering in through the window told him it was already late. Given her physical condition, she'd almost recovered. She got up and dressed, wondering if she'd missed any important work. Although she had made further progress with David, the Lord of Wintertown, she wasn't ready to give up her original job. She hoped to remain David's secretary, helping him reach ever higher heights. At this moment, Eva felt a shift in the holy light within her. Then, a beam of light descended from the void, and she felt something shift within her body. Is this the baptism of holy light? Chapter 216 The Power of Water. Eva finally gained the holy light's recognition. During dinner, Laura, Helen, and Gwen congratulated her with a mingled mix of emotions. Laura, having already mastered the holy light, congratulated Eva sincerely. Helen's congratulations were tinged with obvious envy. She, too, longed to attain this miraculous power, as if it would lift her from the level of ordinary humans and transform her into a godlike being. More importantly, if she couldn't transcend mortals, her dream of becoming the mistress of Wintertown would likely remain just that, a dream, practically impossible to achieve. Just consider that David, a god, couldn't possibly marry a mortal. It wasn't simply a matter of compatibility, the lifespan of mortals was incredibly short, a significant issue. Gwen's thoughts were simpler. She was simply troubled by the fact that she'd spent too little time in Wintertown, giving too many people the opportunity to exploit her vulnerability. As for the holy light, she felt she had grasped the key and might soon master it herself. Everyone chatted about various topics as they ate, but today's conversation focused primarily on the events of the day. What a colorful day! Things had been happening non-stop since morning. First the arrival of the Dark Elf siblings, then the official establishment of the Wintertown Navy and the commissioning of Wintertown's first warship. The Dark Elf siblings brought the most valuable information. Cecil and Enid, the siblings, planned to rest briefly in Wintertown, replenish their water and food, and then continue their journey north along the Winter River, heading for the northern peak. Laura told David everything she had asked, not shying away from the other women. Everyone present could be considered David's close associates. Laura saw Helen as another investor after herself who was ready to make a big bet on David. Such a beautiful woman, with her beautiful figure and the generous dowry she had offered, was already right at David's doorstep. It was only a matter of time before she was devoured. Does that mountain have a name in the Dark Elves' records? The Dark Elves call the peak the World Pillar. That's a very descriptive name. The name suggests the mountain holds a high status in the eyes of the Dark Elves. I'm planning to go to the World Pillar with Cecil and the others. As an archaeologist, Laura's fascination kicks in when encountering such situations. Lately, Laura hasn't embarked on any major archaeological adventures, save a few trips to search for the great northern wolf in the winter forest. Besides that, she's been studying, practicing her skills, and occasionally checking in on the Crawford group. Life has been peaceful and stable, as if the energetic, adventurous Laura Croft is gone. It turns out it wasn't that Laura had changed, but rather that she'd been lacking suitable destinations to spark her adventurous spirit. The destination offered by the Dark Elf siblings this time was precisely the kind of destination that would spark her adventurous spirit. In fact, even without the siblings, Laura would have planned to explore the northern peaks. Now she's simply moving her plans forward. Winter is almost here, David warned Laura. Going north at this time is too dangerous, isn't it? The Dark Elf siblings weren't familiar with the climate here, but Laura certainly wasn't. Wintertown's winter weather was already bad enough, and further north, at the World Pillar, it would be even worse. With Wintertown's current technology, we don't have to worry about that, right? That's true. Thinking of this, David decided he should go along. Who knows what profound secrets he might uncover there. As for whether leaving Wintertown would have a negative impact on the territory, David thought carefully and didn't think so. He could stay in touch with Wintertown via communication equipment. More importantly, with the arrival of winter, all activities on the northern plains would be restricted. Neither the orcs nor the humans of Snaufort would likely pose a threat to Wintertown. Even the two factions, already at a standoff and poised for war, might temporarily suspend hostilities due to winter, waiting for the arrival of spring before resuming their campaign. Even if the orcs truly ignored the freezing cold and bypassed Snaufort to attack Wintertown, or even if the Snaufort residents went berserk and attacked Wintertown, with Wintertown's current combat capabilities, they could easily defeat the invading enemy. In other words, whether David was personally in charge or not, Wintertown's safety wouldn't be threatened in the slightest. Weatherby Swan handled government affairs, Gareth Stanton handled military affairs, Floyd and James Norrington trained the new recruits, and Eva was in charge of collaborating and soliciting support. He could definitely go out and see what the so-called World Pillar held. Laura, of course, wouldn't object when he shared his plans. She had never ventured out with David before and was eagerly anticipating this one. Gwen was envious and wanted to go too, but unfortunately, she had to go back to school. Helen knew she'd only be a burden if she went along, so she stayed put at Castle Glamorgan. She began to wonder if she should learn some combat skills, or at least some self-defense skills. After dinner, Helen called Eva over to ask who she should learn combat skills from. David and Laura discussed necessary preparations. Gwen listened quietly. She had nothing else to do but cling to David. Nothing special, he said. It was mainly weapons and equipment, as well as mountaineering and polar gear. Laura couldn't think of anything else she needed to bring. Food and water. These days, important figures in Wintertown all have their own storage devices, and they can bring more if necessary. Even if each device can only hold 1 cubic meter of supplies, carrying 4 or 5 is like carrying a small truck. That's all, David thought for a moment, preparing to upgrade his own. After years of persistent practice, his alchemy skills have improved considerably. He can now easily perform basic changes in the appearance of matter. As for changing the properties of objects, that requires a much longer and more gradual process, primarily requiring exposure to an understanding of various substances. But for things he frequently encountered, he was already capable of a rudimentary transformation. Take, for example, the storage bracelet on his wrist. It was originally a mass-produced item manufactured by Pierre Newton, and everyone received the same one. It was unassuming and unencumbering. Each bracelet held 1 cubic meter of space, but David, constantly analyzing this spatially intelligent material, had gained some experience. After removing the items from the bracelets, David began experimenting with increasing the internal capacity, successfully increasing it to 5 cubic meters. He then upgraded Laura's storage bracelet, also increasing it to 5 cubic meters, thus eliminating the need for them to carry multiple pieces of storage equipment. Gwen didn't ask David to upgrade her own storage bracelet. She didn't need it at the moment. 1 cubic meter was sufficient for her. While David concentrated his hands on the alchemy array to upgrade the storage bracelet, Gwen and Laura sorted through the pile of items David had taken out. David usually carried only firearms, ammunition, a war hammer, and a spear. Seeing the spear, Laura remembered the trident she'd brought back for David. "Where did you get that Poseidon trident?" Turning around, she saw the mannequin in David's bedroom, used to display the Lightbringer suit, leaning on the oddly shaped trident. Taking the trident, Laura looked at it and the spear side by side, realizing how ugly the strange-looking trident truly was. It was because she had brought it that David was willing to display it in his bedroom. After examining it for a few moments, an idea suddenly struck her. "Can you use alchemy to fuse these two weapons?" I'll try. While alchemy could certainly accomplish this, David wasn't sure he could, especially after analyzing the trident and sensing its mysterious power. Laura's suggestion had David eager to give it a try. After all, it was a magical artifact with mysterious powers. It would be a shame to leave it unused because it was so ugly. If I could fuse it with my spear, giving the trident a more stylish look, wouldn't I be able to carry it out and stab people? Even if I didn't use it to stab people, it would still be nice to show off. David glanced at the spear, a mixture of light cast iron and various alloys, and the trident, a mixture of unknown materials and endowed with mysterious powers. He reached out and released an alchemical array, enveloping the two weapons. To envelop the two weapons, the alchemical array grew enormous, forcing David to stand and spread his arms to perform alchemical magic, as if holding a giant ball. His alchemical proficiency wasn't yet advanced. If it were Pierre, the moment he used the alchemical array to contain an object, its size would be compressed, making it easier for him to perform alchemical magic. The two weapons, trapped within the polygonal alchemical array, gradually transformed into two long, dazzling, and shimmering objects, slowly merging together. As David manipulated them, the fused long beams of light gradually revealed their true form. The two long weapons eventually merged into a single golden spear. The alchemical array had dissipated, and David was examining the spear in his hand. After his own ray refining, David was surprised to discover that the spear not only perfectly retained the holy light properties bestowed by the light cast iron, but also revealed its own mysteries to him, emanating from the mysterious power of Poseidon's trident. Holding this spear, David could gain the power of water. The power of water. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 217, Changes in Winter Town. What exactly is this so-called water power? David experimented with it out of curiosity and soon discovered that when he swung the spear, the blade seemed to generate streams of water. This current could be manipulated to create impact, pressure, or cutting effects, as David desired. It feels like a little extra water effect. Beyond that, he didn't notice anything special. Perhaps he could try it later in the Winter River, where there's more water. After storing the spear in his storage bracelet, which had expanded to 5 cubic meters, David pondered what to bring with him. He definitely needed to carry the Holy Light Hunter and ammunition, as well as the Hammer of Judgment. These were David's personal weapons. There wasn't much else he needed to bring. As for the bow and arrow, he had the bow and arrow set Laura had given him. It was a hunting bow made with modern technology and materials, and it was quite powerful. Combined with his mastery of the Holy Light, it could be used to perform skills like Holy Light Shot, making it quite powerful. So, after a few seconds of hesitation, he decided to take it. Unexpectedly, Laura suddenly reached out and grasped the hunting bow. What, isn't it time to upgrade your hunting bow? You mean I can use alchemy to upgrade it? Like the spear, David suddenly thought this was a good idea. He discovered that alchemy, besides being able to change the shape and properties of objects at will, can also effectively fuse two pieces of equipment with different properties. Isn't this the perfect equipment upgrade? However, it seems that he doesn't have many suitable materials to enhance the hunting bow. He can't just use the fragments of Frostmourne as enhancement materials, right? You're thinking wrong. I mean, I can replace the bowstring, huh? Laura explained, and David realized that with the arrival of the orb silk spiders, Winter Town had a stable supply of silk. The silk of the orb silk spiders can be used to make a variety of clothing and shoes, and because of its special properties, it can even be used to make weapons. And Peter Parker also contributed his own spider silk technology. By combining the silk of orb weaving spiders with Peter's existing expertise, he created a highly resilient and strong thread. By blending this thread with various materials, a more powerful and durable bowstring can be created. Currently, Sylvanus, Addis, and even Krauser, all of Wintertown's archers, are using this new bowstring. Only Lord David, though, is the only one who spends his time throwing hammers or shooting people with guns, and more often unleashing terrifying bursts of holy light. While he practices archery, he rarely uses it in combat anymore. So that's how it is. Over the past 6 months, Wintertown has superficially seen the completion of various infrastructure projects, finally taking on the appearance of a town. But the development behind the scenes is even more astonishing. The Crystal engine has reached its third generation, proving that Sheldon, Leonard, Howard, and Raj have invested considerable time and effort in this endeavor. Furthermore, with the increase in the number of strange members of Wintertown, resources have become more abundant, and some equipment has been upgraded. Bowstrings, for example, are a seemingly insignificant item, yet they have a significant impact on Wintertown's combat effectiveness. Bows crafted from new materials can shoot arrows faster, farther, and with greater force, and their lifespan is greatly increased, benefiting all of Wintertown's hunters. This is just one of the changes. There are many more in Wintertown that David often overlooks. I just happened to learn about them today from Laura. For example, Addis has recovered well. After consuming the golden apple, his health has returned to peak form, and his control over the holy light is growing stronger. If nothing unexpected happens, Wintertown will soon have a true holy light hunter. Krauser's strength is also steadily improving. He is no longer a drag on the Winter Order, relegated to a specialized role as an instructor. He can even be considered Wintertown's first true hunter, his performance even earning the approval of Sylvanus. After hearing Laura's comments, David felt it was time to assign Krauser some missions, such as bringing Krauser along on this expedition to the Northern World Pillar. Besides Krauser, the only other person in Wintertown who could become a true hunter was Alfie, the half-elf adopted by Addis. Due to Wintertown's circumstances, Alfie didn't have to hide his ethnicity. After all, Sylvanus and Liadrin wandered around with their pointed ears, and no one dared to bother them. Add to that the presence of the Transformers, a group of life forms so different from theirs, and Alfie, a half-elf, was completely inconspicuous. He lived a carefree and happy life, learning hunter skills and occasionally going hunting in the forest to put his knowledge into practice. Thanks to his positive attitude and talent, his skills were steadily improving. As he grew older, he expected to become a skilled hunter. Besides these individuals, Gareth Stanton and Floyd are currently training to become paladins. Both are remarkably determined, having chosen a more traditional paladin training method, rather than the infusion of holy light, where one first learns how to master it, then gradually comprehends it, and ultimately attains its true recognition. Instead, they have opted for the more traditional paladin training method, with Renaud Magraine serving as their instructor. According to Renaud, these two knights possess strong wills and excellent character, and becoming paladins is only a matter of time. Coupled with the ambulance, which is said to be just one step away from breaking through, and has been contemplating it in the garage lately, it seems Wintertown's combat effectiveness is poised for a surge. This is just the beginning. With Krauser and Alfie becoming hunters, Wintertown's knowledge is steadily being passed down. Once Gareth Stanton and Floyd become paladins, the entire Order of Winter will become paladins. At that point, a Winter Order comprised of both hunters and paladins, each clad in the most advanced power armor, accompanied by chaplains. Along with many transformers, they boarded a crystal-powered transport ship, heading to the battle site. Nearby were frigates, also powered by crystal and equipped with crystal defenses. Farther away, a massive space battleship loomed. Though its shape was unclear due to the darkness, David had already reserved a spot for it. Thinking of that scene, David could barely contain his saliva. Slurp, he wiped his lips, and drifted off to sleep, filled with hope for the future. The next day, David, after a night of beautiful dreams, woke up refreshed. He showed no signs of discomfort from the excessive dreaming. Instead, the stimulating images filled him with energy. However, many things couldn't be rushed. For example, he had imagined the mighty Winter Legion marching to the front lines, but the reality was that Weatherby Swan reported to David that Wintertown was currently experiencing strong development and a significant increase in population, but there were signs of security problems, and the town's sanitation was beginning to decline. Wintertown used to be a smaller, less populated area, mostly concentrated under the Lord's watchful eye. Therefore, David's requests for residents to use the restroom and dispose of their trash in designated areas didn't elicit resistance. Over time, good habits developed, and in Wintertown's early years, sanitation was excellent. Now, every household has its own bathroom. No more communal restrooms or pee buckets, simply discard your trash in designated bins. It's much simpler than before, and naturally, there's no reason to disobey. But things haven't been the same for newcomers. They've become accustomed to doing as they please, and no one used to police such matters. This has led to widespread public urination and littering in Wintertown lately. As David's gaze shifted towards Snowfrost and Frostwatch, he noticed that the Knights of Winter were patrolling farther afield, with fewer patrols within the town. This lack of authorized oversight has allowed those in power to act even more freely. So, establishing a security team must be put on the agenda. Yes, I see. David had never imagined that the reason for Wintertown's security and police force wasn't some fight or murder, but rather something as trivial as littering and public urination. It sounded like a trivial matter, but he desperately didn't want his Wintertown to be filled with a stench of feces, urine, and garbage like those cities in Iron Tree Castle. David thought about it and realized that suitable candidates were scarce. Mark was the only one who could be stationed in Wintertown permanently and possessed sufficient combat power to ensure he could suppress troublemakers without causing any harm. Mark, having been a shaman for some time, should have been able to control the force of his discharges, leaving a lasting impression on unruly individuals without actually harming them. The only problem was that Mark would soon be returning to Earth, and frequent visits to Wintertown wouldn't be convenient from the spaceship. This meant that Mark would be away from Wintertown for a while, so David still needed to find a suitable sheriff. Oh, right, it seems Squirtle could do the job, too. Anyone who litters or urinates or defecates anywhere can be sprayed in the face with water by Squirtle. And scattering Squirtle throughout Wintertown could also help prevent fires. Just as David was pondering this, Mark suddenly ran over, looking surprised and asking David, "What have you been doing lately, huh?" Chapter 218 A True Mine at Home. Just as he thought of Mark, he came running over. David wondered if he had awakened some kind of telepathic connection. He quickly realized he was wrong. Mark had clearly discovered something unusual and had rushed to find him. "What's going on? Follow me." David didn't waste any time, following Mark out of Castle Glamorgan and arriving at the Winter Alchemy Workshop, located northeast of Winter Fortress. This is one of the more unique buildings in Wintertown, located very close to Winter Fortress and protected by both Winter Fortress and the Winter Barracks. It sits in the heart of Wintertown. Its location also underscores its importance. Besides Pierre Newton and Will Turner crafting various alchemical products, the Winter Alchemy Workshop also serves as Wintertown's research center. Currently, the entire alchemy workshop focuses on crystal ore, Wintertown's specialty. Mark's sudden, hasty search for David stemmed from the surprising changes in the crystal ore. The crystal mine was originally planted behind David's cabin, hidden behind a wooden shed. With the construction of Fort Glamorgan and Winterhold, this arrangement was no longer feasible, so the mine was relocated to its current location, northeast of Fort Glamorgan. An alchemy workshop was also established there. To ensure the mine's absolute safety, it was placed underground. After arriving at the alchemy workshop, David and Mark took an elevator to the underground space dedicated to the mine. Upon entering the underground space, David was immediately struck. It was roughly the size of a basketball arena, with ample height reserved. While it might be called underground, turning on all the lights gave the impression of entering a vast arena. Originally, the few crystals seemed dwarfed in this empty space. But David didn't see that now. The crystal mine before him occupied almost half the space. The massive, towering crystals were imposing, and if one looked closely, one could even see a light slowly flowing through them. David looked at the vast cluster of crystal ore before him, then at Mark beside him. "Are these crystal ore? When did you discover this?" "I just found out during my routine inspection of the ore." Mark was also startled. Seeing the crystal ore suddenly so large and so voluminous, he thought something had mutated. Fortunately, the crystal ore didn't continue to grow and threaten to burst the underground space. Recovering, Mark immediately realized something must have happened to David, and hurriedly called him over. Approaching the enormous crystal ore, David reached out and brushed his hand over it. The sensation he felt was similar to the previous crystal ore, yet also somewhat different. The similarity lay in the peaceful feeling, while the difference lay in the energy contained within the crystal ore, which seemed even more immense. "Have you changed recently? Or has Eva changed?" Mark, now calm, had regained his composure and immediately guessed several possibilities. The appearance of the crystal ore was related to Eva and David, and its subsequent upgrade was also related to David. So, if anyone claimed that David had nothing to do with the ore's current changes, Mark would definitely slap him in the face and make him reconsider his words. David had nothing to hide, so he simply explained his and Eva's situation. Mark's face was filled with disbelief. David assumed he was thinking that the sheer volume and size of the crystal ore was a bit far-fetched. Unexpectedly, Mark's focus was on something else. You just state, Eva, you two were always flirting and nuzzling around, oblivious to everyone else. I thought you were already together, even though it was all true. Why did it sound so uncomfortable? Mark knew he'd finished the joke and steered the conversation back to normal. But is that the only reason? The growth is ridiculous. It can't be related to Eva mastering the holy light, right? Oh, Eva had truly mastered the holy light, completely different from her previous life, when she relied solely on David to infuse and replenish it. Now, Eva had truly entered the realm of the transcendent. Could it be that because Eva has grown stronger, the crystal ore created by her has also become stronger and more plentiful? David wasn't sure if Mark's guess was correct. After all, he didn't have a definitive answer. Regardless, Eva had surprised him once again. He'd previously thought the crystal ore production was too low, but now it had multiplied by who knows how many times. He no longer had to worry about reserves. Now that's what a mine looks like. He happily touched a few more handfuls of crystal ore, feeling the surging energy within. It seemed the day was not far off when everyone in Wintertown would be using crystal-based products. As the crystal ore grew larger and stronger, Wintertown's appeal to the Autobots would skyrocket. The Autobots should be able to use this pure, attributeless energy to replenish their own energy. Perhaps, with sufficient renewable energy at their disposal, he could even recruit Decepticons? After all, not all Decepticons were like Megatron, otherwise, there wouldn't be Decepticons switching sides. Some Decepticons, besides being belligerent, simply wanted to survive. David provided them with a living environment and positions where they could better utilize their abilities and value. The possibility of the Decepticons joining Wintertown seemed possible. He could discuss this topic with Optimus Prime sometime. He wondered what the Autobot leader thought of such a thing. He needed to know. After all, recruiting the Decepticons was still just a concept, while the Autobots' ties to Wintertown were growing stronger. David didn't want to cause resentment among existing allies over a piece of aid he hadn't yet secured. He stood there and watched for a moment, watching Leonard, Howard, and the others rush over upon hearing the news. After expressing their amazement, they hurriedly took samples and conducted tests, hoping to determine how much the energy intensity within a similarly sized crystal ore had changed compared to before. He also marked and recorded the sampling locations, intending to continuously observe and determine the crystal's growth rate. If it continued at the same rate, given its enormous volume, the yield would be astonishing. In that case, Wintertown could completely abandon conventional ammunition and switch entirely to powerful ammunition infused with crystal powder. While the scientists were busy, David mentioned the sheriff's position to Mark. While I'm very interested in becoming the sheriff of Wintertown, I don't have much time left to leave Mars. Earth had already dispatched a spaceship and a rescue team, and with only a few days left until the rescue team arrived on Mars, he would board the rescue ship and return to Earth. Unlike the original storyline, this rescue team wasn't Mark Watney's original companions, and he was completely unfamiliar with them. Furthermore, even if he did, he wasn't prepared to reveal Wintertown's secrets. He didn't see any benefit in sharing them. To conceal this secret, he couldn't frequently disappear from the ship during the return trip. The safest option was to remain on board until they safely returned. I also planned to use this long voyage to cultivate my shamanic knowledge. What would it be like to cultivate shamanism in outer space? Could he comprehend the spirits of stars? The spirit of dark matter? The spirit of cosmic storms? The spirit of the great attractor? What a shame. It seems Elizabeth has to take on this position. Elizabeth was a capable individual, having outmaneuvered Jack Sparrow and even become the Pirate King. Coming from a privileged background, she had become well informed after arriving in Wintertown, making her more than qualified to be the town's sheriff. If she had any questions, she could always consult her father, Weatherby Swan. The reason he didn't directly appoint Elizabeth as sheriff was because Weatherby Swan wanted to avoid suspicion. He was already a counselor in Wintertown, and his future son-in-law, Will Turner, was currently one of the directors of the Wintertown Alchemy Workshop. If his daughter became sheriff, the Swan family would become the preeminent family in Wintertown. Weatherby Swan, a longtime official, felt this was a bad idea. It would be too conspicuous and would easily arouse the Lord's suspicion. David could guess some of Weatherby's thoughts, and out of respect for the counselor, he had not offered Elizabeth any position. I couldn't think of a suitable candidate right now. Even if someone new came, they'd need some time to learn and adapt to life in Wintertown before they could truly take on the job. So, let Elizabeth take over right away. Besides Elizabeth, we can also have the Autobots help patrol the town. These towering Cybertronians, roaming in human form, are quite intimidating, perhaps even more effective than the puppets in Silver Moon City. Elizabeth Swann will be in charge. With the newly recruited security officers, some Autobots, and Squirtle, this team should be able to solve Wintertown's security problems. With the security solution secured and the significant increase in crystal ore production, David was in high spirits. On his way back to the office, he gave Eva a big kiss, which made her, baffled yet delighted, smile brilliantly. With his business done, David began to think again about his expedition north. This time, he wasn't considering equipment, but personnel. Besides Krauser, he planned to bring along Medivh. If he encountered any mysterious traps or problems there, the former Guardian would be a good solution. Who else should I call? David suddenly felt like teaming up for a dungeon run. Chapter 219, a 10-man adventure team. Medivh, Jaina, Sylvanus, Laura, David, and Krauser. David only informed Medivh, but fellow mage Jaina also learned of the matter and was interested in the distant mountain called the World Pillar. So Jaina Proudmoore joined the group. Sylvanus and Laura were close friends, so it was natural for Laura to bring her friend along on any adventure northward. If it weren't for Mark's unique circumstances, he would have been eager to join the expedition. You know what? I haven't left Wintertown since I arrived in this world. Every time Mark mentioned this, his face was filled with resentment. Frequent trips to the Mars base to maintain contact with Earth and report his progress meant Mark couldn't go anywhere. So, despite being one of the first Earthlings to arrive on the Bronia continent, Mark's knowledge of this world was limited. The farthest he'd gotten was a brief tour of the Winter Forest. And that was because Wintertown had expanded its actual territory into the Winter Forest. You'll be back on Earth soon, and then you'll be free. Mark listened to David's words of comfort and felt a sudden urge to cry out to the heavens. However, he resisted the urge to do so in public, considering it would be foolish to do so. After comforting Mark, David officially appointed Elizabeth Swann as Sheriff of Wintertown. Her duties were heavy, as Wintertown hadn't yet implemented a detailed job description, leaving Elizabeth with a vast and complex responsibilities. Maintaining public safety, sanitation, and fire safety within Wintertown meant she was essentially responsible for the Public Security Brigade, Urban Management Brigade, Police Department, Fire Department, and even some emergency medical services. But Elizabeth wasn't intimidated by the sheer volume of the task. Instead, she seemed eager to take on the challenge. It was clear that the days of inactivity had worn thin on this overly energetic woman, and now that she had something to do, she finally had something to channel her excess energy into. I'll have Hot Rod and Squirtle as your assistants. Hot Rod was a new Autobot who had just arrived in Wintertown. According to Optimus Prime, Hot Rod had spent a long time on Earth and was familiar with humanity, so he was reluctant to leave. But now, with the Autobots gradually migrating to Wintertown, Hot Rod was forced to bid farewell to his old friends and begin a new life. Rest assured, Lord, I will restore Wintertown's security and sanitation to their former state. Elizabeth, despite her comfortable life, was dissatisfied with the current state of Wintertown's security and sanitation. Elizabeth, having lived a comfortable life, disliked filth. Upon arriving in Wintertown, she was captivated by its cleanliness and beauty, and witnessed a transformation of this beautiful village into a larger, more tidy city. She couldn't bear to see such a beautiful city become as filthy as the civilian areas of Port Royal. She had privately discussed this with her father, but she hadn't expected the Lord to directly appoint her to take charge of these tasks. Miss Swann, ready to take on the challenge, didn't think she couldn't handle the job. She wanted to teach those who didn't know the rules what they meant. As for the manpower, you can ask Floyd at the recruit camp. David had originally wanted Elizabeth to recruit additional personnel. But then he realized that there was no guarantee that all the 50 recruits would be qualified members of the Order of Winter. It would be a waste to just throw the rejected recruits back into the ranks. After all, they had received some military training, so they would surely be more deployable than ordinary soldiers. Furthermore, their training had given them a certain level of military proficiency. At least their physical fitness, basic combat skills, and weaponry wouldn't need to be taught from scratch. With these matters settled, David had some free time. He planned to take advantage of this free time, and with winter still to arrive, to join the Dark Elf siblings on their journey to the World Pillar. Such a fun thing. How could you forget me, Tony? Upon learning David was heading north, expressed his willingness to join. Steve, who had been free lately, also wanted to go along. Fortunately, Sheldon and his companions were busy studying the drastically altered crystal ore, and they were fully aware of their own self-preservation capabilities. After a moment's hesitation, they gave up the idea of going with him. Even with so many superheroes and magical creatures as companions, they didn't feel they had the physical fitness to keep up with him. Even after eating the golden apple and learning alchemy, their own strengths were enhanced, and they still couldn't compare to this group. However, they didn't have to worry about missing out on any exciting events or scenes. Both Iron Man's suit and David himself possessed powerful recording capabilities, replaying the entire process as a holographic video. It would definitely be more exciting and shocking than watching the latest special effects blockbusters, and even more immersive. Anyone else want to join? Since there were already enough people, David didn't mind more. After asking around, he finally confirmed that these were the people heading to the World Pillar: Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, Janet Proudmoore, Medivh, Sylvanus, Laura, Krauser. Including David and the siblings, there were 10 people in total. How do we get there? The fastest way, of course, is by plane. Wintertown offers a clear view of the mountain known as the Pillar of the World, but that doesn't mean it's close to that peak. The saying "seeing the mountain is a dead horse" might not exist in every world, but its meaning is universally understood. It's just 10 people, and the Quinjet has more than enough room inside to accommodate them all. Everyone's gear is in storage, requiring only a small amount of additional supplies. The Quinjet's speed ensures they can travel back and forth in the shortest possible time, without wasting too much time on the road. That settled, with everything mostly arranged, David went to find the Dark Elf siblings. The siblings, housed in Jonah's Winter Inn, didn't seem anxious at all. After touring Wintertown, they'd become intrigued by this novel human town. They felt it would be a good idea to stay a few days and experience the exotic locales. When David found the siblings, Enid was happily admiring her newly purchased clothes and shoes. David glanced around and saw they were all items from Penny's Blossom Fashions, the most popular boutique in Wintertown. Besides selling a wide selection of stylish, ready-made clothes, they also accepted custom orders. With their affordable prices, Penny's Blossom Fashions quickly dominated Wintertown's clothing market. I heard Penny and Liadrine were hiring new tailors, a testament to their popularity. My lord, are you planning to go with us to the Pillar of the World? Yes, Cecil knew Laura was going to join him and his sister, as she explained she was also an archaeologist. He didn't think it was strange for her to want to join him on a possible expedition to ancient ruins. But why would Baron David Glamorgan, the Lord of Wintertown, also go? While the World Pillar isn't particularly close to Wintertown, it's not so far away that it's out of sight. As the Lord of Wintertown, it doesn't seem strange for me to check out the situation around my territory, Cecil nodded, finding David's explanation reasonable. So, you're planning to head north with Laura on my ship? No, we're going north together in a Quinjet. It's faster that way. Quinjet. Cecil thought of the pink aircraft he'd seen before, but that couldn't possibly hold more than a few people, so he understood the Lord was referring to another type of aircraft. Is it a transport aircraft? I guess so. The Quinjet is a multi-purpose fighter. Despite its name, its primary function is transportation. We're scheduled to depart before noon tomorrow. Is that enough time for preparation? Yes, Enid and I only need to take our personal equipment. Cecil didn't object. If they could reach the World Pillar sooner, it would be a good thing for him. As an archaeologist, he desperately wanted to know if the information he had found was accurate. Could he find relics left by the Dark Elves in this place? What kind of records could he find? Could he learn more about the history of the Dark Elves and the continent of Brunia? These things fascinated him so deeply that he didn't even notice when David left until his sister smacked him. What do you think of this outfit? Seeing Enid wearing those strange high heels, Cecil thought they were incredibly awkward. I heard that clothing store can make custom shoes that not only don't hinder movement but also add special effects. Enid planned to order a pair, hoping to get them ready when she returned from the north. As for these ordinary items, could she bring them back to her friends? Or, maybe she could open a similar fashion store in the Eternal Night Empire? She thought the style of clothing and shoes in Wintertown would be very popular with the Dark Elves. If we can find ancient ruins, perhaps we'll become the Eternal Night Empire's top historians. By then, you'll be too busy to even sell clothes. Cecil didn't think this so-called fashion store would be successful. He was more looking forward to returning to the Eternal Night Empire with his new discoveries and receiving the worship and respect of his compatriots. Maybe even join the Council of Elders with these discoveries. Chapter 220 Ancient Relics of the Dark Elves. The Dark Elf siblings had indeed brought only minimal gear. Besides a pair of double blades each, they each carried a backpack and some sort of jewelry. It's going to be very cold. Are you sure you're alright like this? Steve observed the siblings' attire and felt they weren't heading to the frigid far north, but rather to a sunny beach. That's okay. These are just for protection from the cold. Cecil pointed to the small accessories they wore. While seemingly purely decorative and meant to enhance their attire, they were actually the most common thermal items worn by dark elves. They look great. Beautiful and convenient. Steve, realizing his concerns were unnecessary, didn't say much to the siblings. He and the two historians didn't have much in common. He was more interested in chatting with David. You came here specifically to discuss things with me, didn't you? No, I just wanted to relax and talk, so talking about business is just a side topic. It seems the courses at Kamartaj are giving you a headache. Kamartaj's mage curriculum is extensive and diverse, and to become the Sorcerer Supreme, one must first be a top student. In Marvel's countless parallel universes, Steve has become the Sorcerer Supreme, but his path is somewhat unique. In comparison, Tony Stark could achieve the title through hard work. However, Steve had no intention of giving up. He already knew that the Ancient One's choice of him was based on the Holy Light. He only needed to master the necessary abilities and knowledge for the Sorcerer Supreme, and then, as the Sorcerer Supreme, spread the Holy Light throughout Kamartaj. Then, he could retire with honor. After that, they could either capture Tony to take the blame, or guide Stephen Strange to become the Sorcerer Supreme according to the original historical arc, or let Wanda Maximoff, currently in Hydra's Special Operations Team, take over. These individuals are all good choices. Even if they all have their own problems, there's still a guaranteed winner. Having clearly planned his future and escape route, Steve doesn't face the same pressure at Kamartaj. Hydra, by comparison, presents him with far greater headaches. He's already rescued Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, and even cured Bucky's schizophrenia with the help of the Ancient One. Bucky simply hasn't had the opportunity to clear his name, so he can only continue undercover with him within Hydra. How can Bucky be cleared? Bucky's mission also involves Tony's parents, and Steve hasn't figured out what to do. Furthermore, most Hydra members are ambitious, and a few dry phrases about good and evil won't easily persuade them to betray their faith or leader and join his forces. Even with Steve's immense personal charisma, he still has to satisfy these people's basic needs before he can even poach them. I'm thinking of assigning Rumlow to Wintertown. David looked at Steve, waiting for the next words. Rumlow is very ambitious. He won't be satisfied with just maintaining world peace. He seems more likely to realize his dreams here. You make it sound like I'm some evil villain vying for world domination. That's what you said, not me. Ignoring Steve's joke, David saw nothing wrong with Rumlow. Crossbones Brock Rumlow was a talent, and as for ambition, it wasn't like he was aiming to replace the leader. That bit of ambition wouldn't be a problem for David, and it might even be a boon to him. If you can convince Rumlow to come, I'd love to have him. Absolutely. Steve's official role also included being the commander of SHIELD's frontline operations. The Special Forces team Rumlow oversaw often carried out missions under Steve's command. Later, when Steve joined Hydra, Rumlow also served as Steve's direct subordinate, and their relationship was excellent. Because of their familiarity and understanding, Steve wanted Rumlow to come to Wintertown, to find a more meaningful purpose for the Hydra members, without wasting their abilities and talents, while also further undermining Hydra's ranks. Once Rumlow and his men found new meaning in Wintertown, would they still be willing to work for Hydra? Especially after witnessing the vastness of the world and the powerful forces outside, they would realize the impossibility of Hydra's plans. At that point, they would firmly maintain their existing interests and no longer obey the orders of the original Hydra leader. Steve would then directly overthrow Hydra and become its sole leader himself. Or perhaps he could carry out the cleanup in secret, rendering Hydra a thing of the past, fading into thin air without anyone noticing. That was up to him. After the two men spoke for a while and decided on Hydra's future, the Quinjet arrived at the target area. Cecil, searching for the appropriate location based on the information in his mind, finally directed Tony, who was piloting the Quinjet, to land near the target location. A group of people disembarked from the Quinjet and carefully surveyed their surroundings. Krauser, Sylvanus, and Laura had already grasped their bows. Steve had retrieved his shield from storage, and Tony donned his Iron Man armor. However, after a quick look around, they felt their caution seemed unnecessary. There didn't appear to be any dangerous creatures here. There was little vegetation to be seen, with a few scattered trees to the south. This must be the northernmost part of the winter forest. They were now at the foot of the world pillar. There was no smooth path ahead. To the west lay the vast winter river. Its flow was astonishing, even near its source. Perhaps its source wasn't just melted snow from the mountains. What should we do next? Everyone turned to the dark elf, Cecil. After scanning the area several times, Cecil finally pointed out a direction. Continue toward the world pillar. Mountain climbing? No. Cecil shook his head, dismissing Tony's suspicions. From what I've read, the Dark Elves used to prefer building important structures underground, in caves, so, they were looking for a cave. Continuing forward, Tony Stark, using his Iron Man suit, flew through the air and soon discovered a cave. This cave wasn't hidden at all, and it lay not far from the Winter River. Arriving there, the group saw obvious signs of human intervention at the entrance. They also noticed several collapsed stone pillars and tablets nearby, though badly damaged, bearing dark elf-style patterns. They knew they had found the right place. Much simpler than expected. Things were going so smoothly that Tony once again unleashed his venomous tongue. Could such obvious ruins have already been discovered? Aren't you two arriving a little late? Cecil shared the same thought, but he hadn't found any detailed information about them in the Evernight Empire. Even the information that led him here was a conjecture he pieced together from various records. It probably hasn't been discovered yet. He firmly believed this place was still undiscovered, perhaps because the Evernight Empire was too far away. As for why humans hadn't discovered it, he already knew Wintertown was the farthest edge of the Tiran kingdom, too cold and barren for humans to live there. No one lingered at the cave entrance for long. Whatever the situation, they were already there. How could they stop? No one was afraid to back down. David even spread his hands and condensed a ball of holy light, causing it to hover overhead, acting as a lighting device. Everyone who had just drawn their lighting devices paused. Only Cecil and Enid looked at David, the Lord of Wintertown, in surprise. Until then, the siblings had assumed the Lord of Wintertown was merely a ruler and administrator, hence the so many guards accompanying them on their exploration. Only when David released the holy light did they realize that the Lord was actually a spellcaster wielding mysterious powers. He didn't dwell on it, he had already found the ruins, and he was eager to learn what information they held. Continuing deeper, through a short, somewhat dilapidated, but generally intact corridor, they arrived at a large hall. To better see the hall, David brightened the holy light overhead, raising it higher, like a chandelier illuminating the empty space. David's actions gave everyone a clearer view of the hall. Aside from a small stone platform in the center, there was nothing else around. That's it, Tony glanced around. Besides the erosion of time, there was no sign of damage. You don't have records of this ruins? Is that because there's nothing here? Cecil, looking around, felt a little disappointed. But unwillingly, he quickly walked to the single stone platform, grasping at a last glimmer of hope. Impossible. How could there be nothing here? He scanned the area, still finding nothing remarkable. Just as Enid approached, wanting to comfort her brother, a beam of light suddenly shone from the seemingly ordinary stone platform, shining directly upon her. Chapter 221, Game of Thrones on the continent of Brunia. A beam of light swept across Enid's body and then vanished. The whole process happened so quickly and suddenly, with almost no warning. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the light had vanished. Cecil's reaction was quick enough. Upon noticing the unusual phenomenon, he pulled his sister back a considerable distance, then asked Enid if she felt anything unusual. I'm fine. Enid checked herself up and down, feeling everything, but she didn't notice anything amiss. However, she still drew the two long swords from her waist and grasped them. How about we retreat? Cecil had barely uttered this when a loud rumbling noise was heard. Everyone looked in the direction of the sound and saw that the long corridor they had come from had been sealed off by a stone door. David glanced at the door, then at his comrades around him. Without a trace of worry rising in his eyes, he reminded Cecil, the stone platform has changed. Aside from Cecil, who was concerned for his sister, everyone else immediately noticed the change. The plain stone platform, after emitting a beam of light, suddenly began to crack from the center, breaking apart like a blooming flower. Then, a sphere engraved with strange patterns slowly floated into the air from below. What is that? Steve examined the patterns carefully. They bore a similar style to those seen at the entrance. It must be a dark elf artifact. He was essentially addressing Cecil, hoping this archaeologist from the Dark Elf Kingdom could answer their questions. Unfortunately, Cecil had no idea what it was either. He curiously examined the sphere, trying to decipher the meaning of the patterns. I shall rest here, until a descendant worthy of the priesthood arrives. To everyone's surprise, the person who spoke these words wasn't Cecil, the Dark Elf archaeologist, nor Enid, who had been scanned by the unknown light, but David. Can you understand the text? Tony had been scanning the nearby sphere with his suit, but was met with warnings. The sphere possessed a powerful energy, somewhat similar to the dark energy used on Cecil's ship, yet with significant differences. He had already transmitted the data regarding the patterns on it to Jarvis, who was still analyzing it. Before the Price team had even finished analyzing it, David had already spoken the contents. A talent. David had just realized that his language talent had improved. He glanced at Laura beside him. He had originally thought this ability simply allowed him to better communicate with people from various worlds. He had never imagined that this upgrade would lead to such a change. The Dark Elf language, he had never encountered it before, let alone known it existed. But after just a few glances, he could easily understand the true meaning of the text. No one dwelled too much on David's special ability. They were no longer surprised by his various bizarre abilities. What they cared about was the message David's words conveyed: I will rest here forever. Who is this I? The answer was soon revealed. The sphere, suspended in midair, emanated a brilliant light, and a translucent figure appeared before everyone. It had the same blue skin as Cecil and Enid, with silver-white hair cascading down its waist. It wore the same high defense armor as Enid, and wielded a staff inlaid with an unknown crystal. The translucent dark elf figure opened its eyes, its blue pupils like a deep ocean, seemingly capable of swallowing everything that came its way. The translucent female dark elf glanced at the crowd, noting their composition. So many humans? And elves too? What a strange combination. Oh, what's so strange about that? The female dark elf spoke in an unfamiliar language. Besides the dark elf siblings, only David could understand it. But the next moment, Medivh had also mastered the language. A human who understands the dark elf language. The translucent female dark elf stopped talking to David and looked at Cecil and Enid. She finally sized up Enid. You're the one who woke me up. What a disappointment. I thought a distinguished descendant would arrive here. Before the female dark elf could finish her rant, Cecil interrupted. Who the hell are you, you rude fellow? Haven't any dark elf taught you how to be respectful to a high priest? High priest? What high priest? David translated their conversation for everyone, and everyone finally understood the situation. This translucent dark elf woman was likely a high priest, perhaps holding a distinguished position among the dark elves in the past. Cecil, from the Eternal Night Empire, didn't know who the high priest was. He was an expert in history and archaeology. The information revealed suddenly became exciting. I think there's going to be a lot of fun to watch next, Tony said, drawing the crowd's approval, while also drawing the priestess's disapproval. Human, please don't provoke me, the priestess spoke in the common language of Brunia. While her accent was even stranger than the siblings, at least everyone could understand her. Tony paid no heed to the priestess's threats. Although she had spoken only a few words since her appearance, those few words revealed enough information to suggest she was likely part of a group completely lost in the tide of history. She herself might even be dead. Her current appearance was indistinguishable from a so-called ghost. The ghostly priestess seemed to realize something. She turned to the Dark Elf siblings and inquired about their origins and the current state of the Dark Elves. We are Dark Elves from the Evernight Empire. I'm an archaeologist. My name is Cecil, and this is my sister, Enid. Cecil's brief explanation informed the priestess that the Evernight Empire was the only Dark Elf nation currently in existence, and that a number of exiled Dark Elves lived scattered across the Lost Lands. The priestess hadn't reacted to these details, but when Cecil explained the details of the Eternal Night Empire, the displeasure on her face was palpable, visible to anyone with eyes wide open. The Eternal Night Empire, huh? So it was founded by those traitors, Traitors, Cecil bristled at the priestess's assessment, while David and the others, with gleeful expressions, waited for more revelations. To avoid interrupting the Dark Elf's conversation, David resisted the urge to retrieve a snack from his space. The priestess, Cecil, and Enid chatted incessantly, with David translating as needed. Gradually, the details became clear. Once, the entire Brunia continent was ruled by the Dark Elves, who established a vast and powerful nation. Within the Dark Elf realm, priests serving the Night Goddess held a highly respected position. Elfrida, the woman before them, was a highly respected and revered High Priestess of the Night Goddess. Furthermore, the Night Goddess priests were all women, and at that time, women held a far higher position within the Dark Elf sphere of influence than their male counterparts. Even some female Dark Elves viewed men as mere tools for childbearing and hard labor. While the number of Dark Elves clinging to these outdated beliefs gradually dwindled with the Empire's development, the notion of female superiority and male inferiority remained largely unchanged until the advent of humans. Wait, the advent of humans? Cecil heard a startling piece of information from Elfrida. Humans weren't a native race of Brunia? Did they arrive later? Isn't that so strange? Dark Elves weren't originally a race that lived on Brunia. Cecil was stunned by these two pieces of information, and the crowd gathered to see what a treat it had been. Elfrida's explanation revealed that the Dark Elves' homeland lay east of Brunia, on a vast island where the Dark Elves had originally inhabited. However, as their race grew in size, the island's increasingly depleted resources made it impossible for the Dark Elves to survive. Following a series of natural disasters, the entire island seemed on the verge of collapse, forcing the Dark Elves to migrate to the continent of Brunia. We arrived here, defeated the orcs who once ruled Brunia, and established an era for the Dark Elves. After nearly 1,000 years of development, just as the Dark Elves seemed poised to enter a new era, humans appeared. Just like when we first arrived on the continent of Brunia and defeated the orcs, humans posed a huge threat to our rule, and the Dark Elves and humans began a war that lasted countless years. As for the outcome, the Dark Elves retreated to the western part of the continent and established the Empire of Eternal Night, while humans occupied the eastern part. Elfrida simply curled her lips in disdain at Cecil's words. A group of traitors who abandoned their people and their faith don't deserve to be called Dark Elves. Without waiting for Cecil to inquire, Elfrida offered another description. True Dark Elves never retreat. From your previous description, my true people have all died in the war with humans, and you are nothing more than the descendants of a group of traitors. No wonder you are mixed up with humans. Chapter 222 The Mystery of Brunia Continent. After hearing Elfrida's description, the crowd present wasn't surprised by the Dark Elf priestess's hatred of humans. If what she said was true, then the Dark Elves had essentially been annihilated by humans. This hatred didn't flare up into an attack upon first meeting, most likely because Elfrida's current state prevented her from truly harming anyone present. David was also sorting out various pieces of information from Elfrida's account. The Dark Elves came from beyond Brunia. Humans, like the Dark Elves, had suddenly appeared on Brunia. Now, a group of orcs had suddenly appeared on the northern plains. Was there some connection? The orcs the Dark Elves had vanquished still existed, or had they been completely wiped out by the Dark Elves? Furthermore, according to Elfrida's description, the Dark Elf civilization seemed poised to reach a new level, and their nation was formidable. How had they been defeated by the sudden appearance of humans? He asked all his questions, questions that everyone present wanted to know. Cecil and his sister, too, wanted the answers. Elfrida was annoyed. She didn't want to talk to David, a human. But perhaps she was holding it in too long, and she desperately wanted to speak to someone, even if it was with a human enemy. At least, there were two people in front of her who looked like compatriots. She could just focus on them and explain. The focus was on Enid. Elfrida's attention lingered primarily on Enid. While introducing various information about the priests of the Goddess of Night, she even briefly praised Enid's talent. If she had lived in her time, she would have been trained as a priestess long ago. Perhaps Elfrida wanted to pass on the true faith of the Dark Elves, so she readily answered David's questions. As Elfrida spoke, everyone learned more. Long ago, when the Dark Elves arrived on the continent of Brunia, it was ruled by a race called the Orcs. However, the Orcs didn't establish a unified nation, they were more like a union of tribes. This was because the Orcs couldn't be considered a single race in the strictest sense. Tigermen, Leopardmen, Minotaurs, Centaurs, and other races with half-human, half-beast characteristics are collectively known as Orcs. They typically live together with others of their own race, each choosing a suitable location across the vast continent of Brunia to establish its own settlements. Precisely because of their lack of unity and solidarity, the orcs were easily defeated by the Dark Elves. Under the protection of the Goddess of Night, the Dark Elves crushed the towns ruled by these ignorant fools with overwhelming force and quickly became the new rulers of the continent. Among them, Tigerman, Leopardman, and werewolves offered the most intense resistance and were thus thoroughly purged by the Dark Elves. Other races, such as the Minotaurs, resisted less fiercely and did not strongly oppose the Dark Elves' rule, so some Minotaurs survived. The Centaurs, however, escaped due to their inherent talents. Living on the vast plains, they were exceptionally adept at escaping. After expending considerable effort to hunt down the Centaurs and drastically reducing their numbers, the Dark Elves abandoned them altogether. As long as the Centaurs didn't cause trouble for the Dark Elves, the Dark Elves didn't continue to target them. This was also the reason why both races still existed on this continent. David and the others nearby exchanged glances, each pondering another question. What race dominated Brunia before the orcs took over? Did they still exist? When did the elves appear on this continent? Without rushing to ask, everyone listened to Elfrida answer several more questions. Under the protection of the Night Goddess, the Dark Elves conquered the entire continent, making her their sole deity. Her priests also established a preeminent position within their tribe. Of course, while these priests gained status, they also had to contribute significantly to the development of the Dark Elves as a whole. Under the concerted efforts of the high priests and other priests, the Dark Elves' kingdom advanced continuously, gradually entering a period of great prosperity. It was during this period that humans appeared. Like the Dark Elves, humans arrived from overseas and, like the Dark Elves, crushed the Dark Elves' armies with overwhelming force. Crucially, humans also enjoyed the blessings of the true gods, even more than the Dark Elves. Humanity, by building altars to various gods, has received powerful blessings, from bountiful harvests to powerful battles. David's heart skipped a beat. He exchanged a glance with Laura beside him, both remembering the altar ruins they had found. When Elfrida had mentioned that humans were blessed by various gods, he had assumed they were the gods enshrined in the temple. He hadn't expected it was a different group of gods who had helped humans seize control of the continent. Could it be that the gods worshipped by humans are more powerful than the Goddess of Night? Enid was puzzled. These were gods capable of helping a single race conquer an entire continent. Why were the Dark Elves, worshipping the Goddess of Night, completely unable to withstand the human attack? Elfrida fell silent at this question, and after a long pause, she finally answered, after the arrival of humans, the Goddess of Night stopped answering the Dark Elves' prayers. Based on Elfrida's description, the Dark Elves suspected humans had done something, perhaps setting up some kind of barrier that severed their connection with the Goddess of Night. The Dark Elves attempted various ways to thwart the human scheme, but to no avail. The Dark Elves' kingdom was shattered by the humans' attacks, and with their faith gradually crumbling, the Dark Elves completely collapsed. Some Dark Elves were determined to fight humans to the death, mobilizing their entire forces to fight them. A small number even considered contacting the Minotaurs, Centaurs, and even the Elves, a race they were notoriously hostile to form an anti-human alliance. Other Dark Elves sought ways to reconnect with the Goddess of Night, such as visiting special locations across the continent and building temples to call upon her, hoping that the goddess who had once protected the Dark Elves from their rise to power would once again guide them out of their predicament. Still others considered abandoning everything and escaping to a place beyond human reach. The Dark Elves, divided among their various ideologies, embarked on separate paths, each with its own purpose. Both those who fled to the bitter end and those seeking the goddess utterly despised the escaping Dark Elves, calling them traitors. As Elfrida's narration drew to a close, Cecil finally understood the historical truth he had sought to uncover. Why had the historical information he had previously read been so incomplete? With traces of conflicting deletions and revisions? If Elfrida's account was the truth, then these events would undoubtedly constitute a dark history for the Eternal Night Empire. No wonder they didn't want to be known to future generations. As for the abandonment of faith, Cecil didn't take it too seriously. It was the Night Goddess who had abandoned the Dark Elves first. Was it any wonder that such a deity was abandoned by her descendants? As for the High Priest before him, he saw nothing more than an old-fashioned person living in the past, refusing to confront the truth. David's questions were answered, and Elfrida followed suit with a few more questions. Cecil could answer some of these questions, but not others. Elfrida had no intention of asking other humans or elves. Realizing she could get no further information, she resolutely asked Enid if she wished to accept her legacy and become the new high priestess of the night goddess. Is it still necessary to continue worshipping a deity that abandoned its followers when the Dark Elves faced a crisis of extinction? Enid shared Cecil's sentiments and held no favorable opinion of the night goddess, which displeased Elfrida. The priestess firmly believed that the great night goddess would never abandon her people. It must be humans, or the evil gods they worshipped, who had imprisoned the great night goddess through some means. So, a worthless being who can be so easily imprisoned by the enemy, unable to protect her people, seems equally unnecessary to continue worshipping. These words weren't spoken by Cecil or Enid. Cecil always came across as polite and careful with his words. The only people present who would use such language were Tony Stark and David. But David only complained internally, not out loud like Tony. Instead of continuing to worship the night goddess, why not consider the gods of humanity? Do you know which gods humans worshipped back then? Tony complained, irritating Elfrida while also extracting information and intelligence. The enraged Elfrida didn't dwell on it, and simply named several evil gods, harvest goddess Laludi and war god Sea. Well, under the protection of this war god Sea, humanity completely destroyed the kingdom built by the Dark Elves. He must be an extremely powerful deity. I think even if Enid wants to become a priestess, she should choose to serve this war god, not that night goddess. Foolish human, you will pay for your words. Elfrida, enraged, completely oblivious to her current situation, raised her staff. Suddenly, everyone present noticed something unusual. With Elfrida's movement, the hall's roof transformed into night sky dotted with countless stars. At the same time, a terrifying pressure suddenly appeared, enveloping everyone. Elfrida was surprised to discover that the night goddess had responded to her. However, her joy didn't last more than 2 seconds. The next second, the star-speckled night sky was ripped to shreds by the dazzling divine light. Chapter 223 A Dark Elf Without Dreams. A vast expanse of holy light emanated from David's hands, transforming the star-filled night sky of a second ago into luminous day. Within the hall, no trace of starlight or darkness remained. As the holy light in David's hands grew brighter, the seemingly oppressive aura vanished. Tisk. David had initially thought the goddess of night was truly descending, but once he released the holy light, he realized that the night sky, the stars, and the oppressive aura were all merely part of the spell. Looking at Elfrida, whose face was filled with astonishment not far ahead, David focused a holy light that filled the entire hall into a single point. It transformed into a thick pillar of fire, which descended directly from above her. Boom! The thick, luminous holy fire instantly engulfed Elfrida and the orb, reducing both to ash in an instant. Whatever Elfrida's current state was, a ghost? A spirit? Or perhaps some magical hologram? Under the burning and pounding of the holy fire, everything turned to dust. The orb was also gone, and David didn't bother to investigate its true nature. If he attacked, he'd be mistaken for an enemy and utterly destroyed. Once David was certain the priestess was dead, he gently flicked his hand, and the remaining holy light in the surrounding space coalesced, transforming into a radiant orb that hovered above everyone, continuing to serve as illumination. From Elfrida's fury, the hall transformed into a starry night sky, to the holy light shattering the night sky and coalescing into holy fire, incinerating Elfrida and the orb, and then returning to normal. The entire process took only a few seconds. It took no ordinary person present to comprehend what had transpired. The Dark Elf siblings stared at David in astonishment. The Lord of Wintertown had undergone a profound transformation in their eyes. From a young, gentle, and friendly lord to a mysterious and powerful spellcaster. That immense, blazing, luminous power was truly terrifying. If that pillar of fire had struck them, their fate would have been no better than that of the high priest. Tony, standing nearby, was actually witnessing David in action for the first time. He hadn't anticipated his formidable strength. His armor's alarm was still alerting him to the astonishing intensity of the energy that had just erupted. In contrast, Sylvanus, who had witnessed David in action before in Azeroth, remained remarkably calm. In her eyes, David, the embodiment of the holy light, had merely casually released a bit of holy light, a mere trifle of insignificance. As for Steve, it had indeed been a long time since he'd seen David in action, but his constant study of holy light knowledge had given him some suspicions about David's strength. Coupled with the Ancient One's indirect questioning, he had a high opinion of David's abilities. Therefore, Steve didn't appear surprised. Instead, he was preoccupied with something else. "David, what's going on? It seems something is trying to break through the space and enter here." The primary responsibility of Kamartaj's mages is to defend against intrusions from other dimensions and spaces, making them particularly sensitive to such situations. Steve wanted to become the Sorcerer Supreme, and this knowledge and judgment were required. Skipping wasn't an option. How strong is the enemy? It's hard to tell. It feels powerful, but the one trying to get in isn't. Steve carefully sensed the enemy for a moment and offered his guess. Maybe a clone has been sent down? Or perhaps a mind investigating. David nodded. He quickly located the mind Steve mentioned and unleashed a smite. A sudden burst of light exploded in midair. Accompanied by the holy light smite, a patch of insignificant starlight was instantly shattered. Steve took the opportunity to determine its nature. It's something like a contract. What is that? It's like a powerful, mysterious being seeking a spokesperson here. Steve also determined the target of this contract, the Dark Elf, Enid. This being has taken a liking to Enid and wants her to be their spokesperson. Steve spoke without lowering his voice, so everyone could hear him. At the same time, everyone guessed that the mysterious being was the so-called goddess of night. It seems this goddess doesn't care about the death of her high priest, just as she didn't care when the Dark Elves were nearly exterminated by humans. David stood guard for a moment. Nothing else happened in the hall. The night goddess seemed to have no desire to avenge her high priest. After the contract she had made was broken, she took no further action. "Should we leave here first?" Krauser glanced at the people around him. Everyone seemed ready to take action, no one expressed a desire to leave. This made Krauser feel uncomfortable. "I know you're all powerful, but there are no enemies now. Why are you still hanging around in the ruins of a deserted temple?" Krauser soon got his answer. The archaeologists, Laura and Cecil, hadn't rested on their laurels after meeting Elfrida and learning so much about the Dark Elves and the past of Brunia. They all suspected there might be something else within the temple, and they searched and observed it carefully, fearing to miss any clues. Tony was also observing the surroundings, using the various detection devices on his suit to search for any possible information. Steve remained on guard, wary of any intrusion from another dimension. David was discussing a retreat with Jaina. "Is your teleportation spell working properly? Not over long distances, but short distances are no problem." Jaina had spent so much time in Wintertown, diligently researching how to cast magic normally in this world, and so far, the results seemed promising. "The distance from this stone wall to the ruins gate isn't far. I can teleport everyone directly outside." The straight passageway leading in allowed Jaina to make very accurate judgments. With no magical devices nearby to interfere with teleportation, she could easily transport everyone out. In fact, in particularly dangerous situations, Jaina could teleport everyone present back to Wintertown. Hearing Jaina's words, David suddenly realized that his town didn't seem to have any defenses against teleportation spells, so it seemed like something that needed to be put on the agenda. Quel'Therless, Dalaran, and Kamartaj should all have similar technology and knowledge, right? Quel'Therless's defensive technology was difficult to acquire, but Jaina and Steve should be able to help them build defenses similar to those of Dalaran and Kamartaj. Besides teleportation within this plane, Kamartaj's defensive magic could also protect against invasions from other worlds. They won't stop their own people, will they? David, who had already secured a retreat with Jaina, and Steve stood beside Enid. The two men trapped the Dark Elf, leaving Enid bewildered. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Simply preventing the Night Goddess from doing anything else." David and Steve both felt that Enid was in the most danger of all present. These so-called gods probably couldn't take action personally. They would have to choose a person or race on the continent of Brunia to act as their agent. While David couldn't guarantee his guess was correct, taking some precautions was better than doing nothing and expecting something to go wrong. "Do you think it's a bad thing if I become a priestess of the Night Goddess?" Enid had no respect or admiration for the Night Goddess, and she had no particular interest in becoming a priest. This meant that she didn't mind becoming a priest, but judging by the expressions of the two people beside her, it seemed as if becoming a priestess was a bad thing. "Signing a contract with such a powerful being takes away many decisions from you," Steve explained briefly. "Being subordinate to such a powerful being could force you into doing things you didn't want to do. For example, suppose your goddess orders you to return and lead the Dark Elves and retake control of the Brunia continent." David surveyed his surroundings. Laura and Cecil hadn't found anything so far, So it seemed there wasn't anything else useful here. Oh, Enid nodded. Such a possibility was indeed possible. According to Elfrida, the Dark Elves had become the rulers of the Bronia continent under the protection of the Night Goddess. But such a thing wouldn't be a bad thing for the Dark Elves, right? Enid wasn't very good at hiding her thoughts either, and David saw through the Dark Elves' intentions immediately. That might not be a bad thing for the Dark Elves, but it's definitely not good for me. The worst thing about a powerful empire blessed by the gods is that they could directly threaten Wintertown via sea. David didn't want that to happen. Enid glanced at David, realizing that David and Steve weren't really protecting themselves so much as they were protecting themselves. She curled her lips, but ultimately said nothing. She didn't really want to lead the Eternal Night Empire to dominate the continent. Instead, she wanted to happily pursue the things she loved, like buying beautiful clothes, adventuring with her brother, and experiencing the diverse cultures and customs of the land. Her dream was simple, leading her people to continental domination. She left the dream to the more ambitious Dark Elves. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 224, Pursuers from the Eternal Night Empire. After a brief inspection, finding nothing further, the Dark Elf siblings, David, and the others decided to depart. This expedition was a highly rewarding one for everyone. From Elfrida, the High Priestess of the Night Goddess, the Dark Elf siblings learned much of hidden history. They also learned the origins of the Dark Elves, their past glories and lows, the very essence of what Cecil, the historian and archaeologist, sought. But David gained even more. The various situations on the Bronia continent now appeared to be deliberately orchestrated by the gods. So, what role did the gods play? Were they the hidden hand behind the scenes? Guides ensuring a certain balance? Did the emergence of the orcs, like the Dark Elves and humans before them, signal a new reshuffle? Setting aside other considerations, one aspect particularly concerned David. When the Dark Elves entered Bronia, it was the Night Goddess who protected them and enabled them to seize control of the continent. At that time, the Night Goddess's priests held a unique position within the Dark Elf community. But because of this, when humans appeared and the Goddess of Night stopped responding to her followers, the Dark Elves were immediately powerless against humans, who were protected by gods like the God of War and the Goddess of Harvest. Did humans discover the flaws? That's why the temple was created? Something doesn't make sense. David struggled to grasp the specifics. He needed more information about the temple to make a more accurate assessment. Furthermore, what gods were protecting the orcs who had suddenly appeared on Bronia and begun their offensive against human territory? Perhaps the orcs aren't as easily defeated as they appear. This adventure seemed to reveal a hidden hand hidden beyond Bronia. He realized that achieving his original goal would be more difficult than he had initially anticipated. More difficult? Just a little, you think? As they returned to the Quinjet, Tony Stark left the pilot's seat and engaged the autopilot. He, Steve, Laura, and the others were discussing their findings with David. He rolled his eyes when David said the difficulty had increased, but it wasn't a big deal. What else should I say? Hey, men, I don't think my original plan is working. That goal is bullshit. Something like the Winter Empire is impossible to build. Let's just give up on that unrealistic goal, shall we? David spread his hands, deliberately pretending, once we get back to Wintertown, we'll pack up our belongings and go back to our respective worlds. You and Steve go back to the Marvel Universe, and Sylvanas, Jaina, and the others go back to Azeroth. As for David, he was more flexible and could choose any world he liked. However, if David abandoned his hometown, he would most likely lose his cheat code, and there would be no chance for them to meet again. David's description of the Age of Empire scenario, where they started from scratch but collapsed midway, left Tony even more speechless. Well, I'm just saying the difficulty has increased significantly, not that we should give up. In fact, Tony found the current situation more exciting and challenging. What was the challenge of building an advanced empire when ruling only a backward continent? He had always believed that with a genius like himself helping him, it was only a matter of time before David unified the continent of Bronia. Now that he knew everything happening on the Bronia continent was orchestrated by the gods, the challenge was worth it. As for danger? Why was he afraid? His hometown wasn't in Wintertown. How's the satellite going? I was planning to take it slow, But now I might have to speed it up, David nodded. After the satellite launch, Wintertown's communications, weapons, and other equipment would be upgraded. It would also give Wintertown a glimpse into the sky, allowing it to better understand the situation across the continent, and perhaps even the world. Speaking of which, will launching a satellite to track the attention of the gods? Steve's question silenced David and Tony. They both pondered the question. They also considered other implications. Even without considering the gods, would the satellite's launch attract the attention of the Dark Elves? Then we have to launch it. There was no need to stop development just because of external enemies. The more enemies there were, the more they couldn't stop advancing. David planned to use the satellite launch to test whether these so-called gods existed in this plane or in another. Exchanging a glance with Tony, the super genius seemed to share the same thought. Without waiting for David to speak, he declared he knew what he was going to do. I'll carry out a new round of modifications and upgrades. The new satellite will be a multifunctional, two-way detection satellite. Besides observing the land beneath their feet, it will also observe outer space. During launch, various detection and observation devices will be activated. If the launch of the satellite attracts an attack, the new satellite must ensure it can transmit all data back to Wintertown before it is completely destroyed. Any remaining cloaking technology will also need to be implemented. If possible, Tony wanted Steve to add some defensive spells to the satellite to protect it from observation by mystical forces. I'll go back and ask my teacher. I'm not sure if the spells I cast will actually work. Steve didn't think he could hide from the gods' observation. Although he didn't know how powerful the gods of this world were, he wasn't particularly skilled in such spells himself. He might as well ask Jaina and Medivh for help. If you need any help, come to me. Medivh remained silent, remaining quietly to the side. But he'd heard the conversation clearly, and Tony was relieved by his sudden remark. Or perhaps Tony had intended to ask Medivh for help from the beginning, but their relationship wasn't close enough that he'd deliberately spoken to Steve right beside him. I have an idea now. David wasn't lost in thought after a long pause. He was pondering a relatively safe, less risky solution. After some thought, he finally came up with a plan. He laid out his idea. Simply put, Tony would build a new suit, or Iron Soldier. This suit would be remotely controlled and capable of reaching geosynchronous orbit. It would possess optical cloaking, anti-detection, and anti-magic detection capabilities. Ideally, it would resemble the Dark Elves or the Templars. Then, it would fly alone to high altitudes for a test mission. David had already confirmed that the Dark Elves had no satellites. If they successfully reached geosynchronous orbit and weren't attacked, whether they were discovered but ignored, or simply unnoticed, Wintertown should have no problem launching another satellite. If it were destroyed upon takeoff or attracted some unusual entity, it would mean that Wintertown's satellite launch was a suicidal act. This plan should be fine. Steve, judging by the Evernight goddess's previous attempts to find an agent, suspected that these gods weren't that interested in this world. They probably existed in a different dimension from the Bronia continent they were currently on. Steve couldn't guarantee it. Perhaps those so-called gods lived in this dimension, only resorting to such methods because they were so far away. Whatever, let's test it out. After the Quinjet returned to Wintertown, Tony began designing and manufacturing his new suit. He brought Steve, Jaina, and Medivh into the lab to help him build the new suit. Medivh and Jaina were willing to help, motivated by a desire to explore this world more and understand its true nature. They also began designing Wintertown's anti-magic defenses, focusing on spells like teleportation. As for David, upon returning to Wintertown, he chatted with Cecil and Enid. The historical knowledge Cecil had gained this time was not a boon for the Dark Elves' Evernight Empire. With this historical information, Cecil and his sister likely wouldn't be welcomed by the citizens of the Evernight Empire. Their likelihood of being executed under such scrutiny was higher. After hearing David's words, Cecil realized that what he had uncovered wasn't the truth, but poison. As a scholar, he should have brought his findings back to the Evernight Empire. But as a dark elf with an IQ far above average, he wouldn't do such a foolish thing. He also realized why much of the information he had found contained so many omissions and conflicts. He wasn't the Dark Elves' most accomplished historian. Other Dark Elves had already noticed something, but these Dark Elves and their discoveries had been obliterated by the Evernight Empire. What are your plans next? Enid and I will travel to the Lost Lands. Oh, I'd love to know how many of these fallen Dark Elves have simply learned the truth. Cecil offered another reason. If I travel to the Lost Lands and become a fallen Dark Elf, The Evernight Empire won't pursue Enid and me, and thus bring further trouble to your town. Cecil felt that if his judgment was correct, the troops hunting his siblings should already be on their way. He didn't want to cause further trouble for David and Wintertown. David was a little surprised by Cecil's choice. He'd thought the Dark Elf would ask for his help. It seemed he'd underestimated them. Just then, Eva suddenly pushed open the door to the reception hall and entered. Dark Elf warships have appeared on the Winter River and attacked RC. She paused for a second, as if listening to the report coming through her headphones, before continuing. Skyfire and RC have counterattacked, and the enemy ships have been destroyed. Chapter 225 Rick's Partner. David stood by the Winter River, watching the black warships burning and occasionally exploding on the surface. He turned to Cecil beside him and asked, "What rank is this warship in the Eternal Night Empire?" "It's a fast assault ship. This type of assault ship boasts excellent maneuverability. While its firepower and defense are slightly inferior, it's ideal for pursuit missions like this." Considering their targets were two ordinary Dark Elves, himself and his sister, Enid, the issue of insufficient firepower wasn't a concern. What other warship types does the Eternal Night Empire's navy have? Aside from some older models, the main fleet consists of capital ships with strong defense and firepower, assault ships with high maneuverability but slightly less firepower, and protective ships for harbor defense and patrol missions. According to Cecil, naval operations consisted of a combination of capital ships and assault ships, with protective ships remaining at base and, at most, performing offshore patrol missions. This was all he could get from Cecil. He didn't know any more details. "Have you captured any prisoners?" Skyfire and RC remained on guard not far away. Tony's Iron Troopers had already flown to the burning black warship to put out the flames. The Iron Troopers are still searching. "There should be some Dark Elves still alive." Tony observed the black warship in relatively good condition. Skyfire and RC hadn't directly destroyed it, making it unsuitable for a boarding search. The Iron Troopers didn't have that worry. They also wanted to preserve as much of the Dark Elves' military technology as possible. David nodded and glanced around. Gareth, leading 20 fully armed Winter Knights, remained on guard to prevent any unforeseen incidents. Far away, RC also adjusted her direction and began searching further afield, ensuring there were no hidden Dark Elves nearby. Everyone knew what to do at this point. David didn't need to personally monitor and issue orders. After observing for a moment, seeing the Iron Troopers still busy on board and having largely extinguished the fire on the black warship, he turned and glanced at the nearby surroundings. A large crowd gathered near the docks to watch the excitement. With winter approaching, farm work had concluded, and there had been no recent construction work. Aside from the shopkeepers and those working there, the rest of Wintertown's residents were on vacation, preparing for the coming winter, stocking up on food, making pickles, and buying winter clothing. This left many people relatively free, and they flocked to see any excitement. Fortunately, Elizabeth Swan's security team had been established, and the Stonemasons Guild was the only ones enjoying some free time, so no trouble had arisen. Most of the new arrivals to Wintertown were still working hard to secure their futures and had no time to observe the excitement. Besides these two groups, David noticed Rick, who had recently arrived in Wintertown and accepted David's hiring to search for survivors on his own world and increase Wintertown's population, was also there. He was accompanied by several others, curiously observing the surroundings. David could tell from their attire that they were from modern Earth. Rick was incredibly efficient, having helped to boost Wintertown's population so quickly. Although he wouldn't bring many people at once, as long as people kept coming, Rick's work was a success. "Rick? Mr. Mayor." The two greeted each other. Rick still preferred to call David Mayor. He wondered if Rick would address him as Lord of the City or Lord of the Overlord after Wintertown became Winter City. "Are these your friends?" "Yes, they're survivors I found a while ago." Rick briefly introduced the newcomers to David, some of whom David knew, some not. Those he knew included Glenn, a young Asian man, Daryl, known as Darrow, and Sean, Rick's wife, Lori, and son, Carl. David also greeted those he didn't know. Their attitudes varied. Some were polite, some were slightly ingratiating, and some were respectful but wary. David didn't dwell on their attitudes and first congratulated Rick on his successful search for his family. He then asked Rick about his thoughts. "Are you planning to return to your own world and search for more survivors, or settle down in Wintertown?" Rick glanced at his companions, then at his wife and son. Emotionally, he felt the choice was to stay in Wintertown permanently. starting a new life here with his wife and child. He believed Wintertown offered comfortable living conditions, and he and his family wouldn't have to worry about adapting. Besides, their original world was in such a state, being able to live in a place free from the threat of zombies was something worth celebrating. His wife, Lori, and son, Carl, also wanted him to stay, a matter they had discussed before. However, Rick thought of the father and son who had helped him, and he wanted to go back and find the Morgans and bring them to Wintertown as well. If possible, he hoped to find more survivors, as a way to contribute to the well-being of his fellow humans in his own world. I understand, Rick's choice didn't surprise David. Rick wasn't the type to sit idly by and watch others suffer when he had the power to do so. With Wintertown providing him with supplies, logistics, and even security, Rick undoubtedly wanted to help as many people as possible. This also aligned with David's expectations for him. Don't worry about being separated from your family for an extended period. You can search for survivors there during the day and return at night to rest. David described Rick's search for survivors in his world as being no different from going to work during the day. As for the zombie threat, Rick could return to Wintertown at any time, and with his extensive weaponry, the zombies should just hope they didn't encounter him. As more and more Transformers migrated to Wintertown, David was considering pairing Rick with several Transformers. Not only would Rick's search for survivors be more efficient, but they would also allow him to gather resources from that world. A post-apocalyptic world with only a few remaining humans was, for David, a rich resource warehouse, with countless resources waiting to be retrieved. After a few more words, David confirmed that Rick had received the Brownian Common Language learning device from Administrative Officer Weatherby, and that his companions were already using it to learn the local language, and then he took his leave. Watching the Baron of Glamorgan gradually walk away, Rick and his companions continued to gaze out over the river. The Lord's departure also eased the somewhat nervous crowd a bit. Huh? I didn't dare to speak just now, so worried I'd say the wrong thing. Glenn glanced at the now distant David. He looked about his own age, quite young. But this man was the lord of this city. And according to Rick's earlier introduction, a baron. He had never faced such a big shot, especially one who practically controlled their lives and deaths, which made him extremely nervous. Rick's good friend and longtime partner, Sean, also glanced at David. Initially, seeing the so-called Baron of Glamorgan as a mere youth, he hadn't taken him too seriously, dismissing him as a mere noble from a privileged background. But face to face, Sean could sense that this so-called Baron of Glamorgan was no ordinary young man to be trifled with. This was an intuition honed by years of work experience, and Sean, trusting his instincts, refrained from speaking until David was out of the way. Were you and the Baron just discussing the upcoming mission? Yes. Do you need any help? Although Sean had to do some work due to unusual circumstances, he still cared about his old friend. Knowing Rick had to return to that dangerous world, Sean was prepared to go with him so they could keep an eye on each other. If you need anything, I'll be happy to help you, Rick said, patting Sean's shoulder with a smile. While he thought it would be nice to have someone to help him, at least he wouldn't be so lonely and bored while searching for survivors, he felt Sean and the others had more important things to do. Before that, I think it would be best for you to learn the language and adapt to life here as quickly as possible. Rick hoped everyone would seize this second chance bestowed by God and start a new life in Wintertown. The mayor is currently organizing a police force. Sean, you should seize this opportunity. Sean, like himself, was an experienced small-town sheriff. He believed that if Sean quickly learned the local language, he would be able to find a suitable job here. Furthermore, unlike himself, Sean couldn't travel back and forth freely as he did upon returning to that world. For Sean, returning to that world to search for survivors was a dangerous undertaking. He didn't want his good brother to take such risks. But I don't think I'll be of much use here. Sean glanced out at the river in the distance. The strange black warships, the RC-transformed attack planes, the cruisers supposedly transformed from Transformers, and the Iron Soldiers all made him wonder if he had truly arrived in another world. Or was he already dead, and this was just a grotesque hallucination, a combination of every absurd element he could think of? If it was fake, then whether he was used or not was irrelevant. If it was real, then how could he possibly snatch a job from the Transformers and Iron Soldiers? End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.